Tonight, as you settle in, I'll guide you through the frigid world of medieval winters. Close your eyes and picture snow falling silently on a small village, where smoke curls from stone chimneys and candlelight flickers through frost-covered windows. For nearly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, winter was not merely a season, but a formidable adversary that tested human ingenuity and resilience. As you drift towards sleep, you'll discover how our medieval ancestors survived the harshest months of the year without central heating, grocery stores, or modern medicine. Winter in medieval Europe meant the difference between life and death. Each autumn, families faced the same vital question. Had they prepared enough to survive until spring? Had they stored sufficient grain in their barns, salted enough meat in their larders, and gathered enough firewood to keep the deadly cold at bay? A single miscalculation could doom an entire household. A prolonged freeze might devastate a village. Heavy snowfall could cut communities off from trade, assistance, and information for weeks or months when they needed them most. Yet across medieval Europe, from remote alpine settlements buried under snow to windswept coastal fishing villages, people developed remarkable strategies for winter survival. They created ingenious architectural adaptations to preserve precious heat. They established community networks to share resources when individual supplies ran low. They mastered preservation techniques so effective we still use them today. As you drift towards sleep, I'll share these forgotten winter skills that sustained humanity through 1,000 years of medieval winters. You'll discover how these innovations shaped not just survival, but our holiday traditions, our understanding of community, and our relationship with the natural world. For the medieval person, winter wasn't just endured, it was prepared for, adapted to, and sometimes even celebrated despite its dangers. As the last echoes of Roman authority faded across Western Europe in the 5th century, the people faced winter with far fewer protections than they had known for generations. The elaborate hypocaust heating systems that had once warmed villa floors stood cold and crumbling. The great Roman roads that had carried grain shipments through snow and ice fell into disrepair, their stone bridges collapsing into icy rivers. The vast trading networks that had once brought olive oil from Spain and wheat from North Africa contracted dramatically. Winter, always a formidable adversary, now loomed as an even greater threat. Into this challenging landscape stepped peoples whose ancestral knowledge of winter survival ran deep through countless generations. The Germanic tribes, Franks, Angles, Saxons, and others, had developed sophisticated cold weather adaptations long before they encountered Roman civilization. In the forests and marshlands of northern Europe, where winter's grip held tighter and longer than in Mediterranean lands, these peoples had refined techniques for surviving the harshest months that would now prove invaluable. Their dwellings reflected this winter wisdom. Unlike the Roman villa with its open courtyards designed to capture summer breezes, Germanic longhouses were built primarily to retain precious heat. These substantial timber-frame structures, often reaching 15 to 30 paces in length, featured thick walls of wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung plastered over flexible wooden frames. This material provided far better insulation than stone, which conducted cold mercilessly during winter months. The steep-pitched roofs shed snow efficiently while creating space for rising smoke to collect, before escaping through a small opening, warming the upper reaches of the building in the process. At the heart of these longhouses burned the central hearth, not the elegant hypocaust or the tiled Roman fireplace, but an open fire that served as both kitchen and heating source. Smoke from these hearths would rise toward the high-pitched roof, warming the space below while seasoning the wooden beams against insects and rot. Anyone entering such a dwelling in winter would first notice the powerful sensory experience, the sharp smell of wood smoke mingling with the earthier scents of humans and animals, the dimness broken only by firelight, and the surprising warmth compared to the bitter cold outside. Perhaps the most significant adaptation to winter in this post-Roman world was the increased integration of humans and livestock under the same roof. While such arrangements would have horrified Roman sensibilities with their emphasis on architectural separation of functions, they made perfect practical sense. A single cow generates approximately the same body heat as a small stove, and a household with several animals gained significant thermal benefits during freezing weather. Archaeological excavations across northern Europe reveal clear evidence of these byre houses, structures with designated areas for animals at one end and human habitation at the other. On the coldest nights, families would gather on raised sleeping platforms, sharing warmth while telling stories to pass the long darkness. Body heat became a precious resource carefully conserved through communal sleeping arrangements, with family members and sometimes even household servants piling together beneath layers of furs and woolen blankets. Privacy as we understand it today was largely unknown. Winter survival took precedence over personal space. The Celtic peoples of the British Isles and northern Gaul maintained their own distinct approaches to winter's challenges. The circular roundhouses common in these regions, with their conical thatched roofs rising to a central smoke hole, proved remarkably effective at conserving heat. The round shape minimised the surface area exposed to wind and weather, while the lack of corners prevented cold draughts from becoming trapped. Many Celtic dwellings were partially set into the ground, using the Earth's natural insulating properties to maintain more stable indoor temperatures. Winter clothing underwent dramatic changes as well after Roman withdrawal. The fine imported fabrics favoured by the Romanised elite gave way to more practical local materials. Wool became the predominant textile, sometimes layered for additional warmth. Cloaks fastened with simple brooches could be adjusted for changing conditions or wrapped more tightly during sudden snow squalls. Sheepskins and furs, worn with the fur facing inward against the body, provided exceptional insulation. Archaeological evidence suggests that winter garments were often treated with animal fats to increase their water resistance, a practical if somewhat aromatic solution to winter precipitation. Food preservation techniques blended Roman knowledge with indigenous practices. Salt preservation continued wherever salt could be obtained, though the elaborate garum, fermented fish sauce production facilities of the Roman era, disappeared. In coastal regions, winter often became the season for producing sea salt, as lower temperatures actually aided the evaporation process when brine was exposed to wind rather than sun. In inland areas, smoking became the predominant preservation method, with specially constructed smoking chambers identified at numerous settlement sites from this period. The management of fuel resources became increasingly sophisticated as communities adapted to their post-Roman reality. Where Roman Britain had utilised coal from surface deposits in Northumbria and elsewhere, most communities returned to wood as their primary fuel. Evidence from pollen records reveals the development of intensive woodland management techniques, systematic coppicing, cutting trees at the base to encourage multiple new shoots, and pollarding, cutting branches higher up to promote new growth out of reach of grazing animals. These methods allowed sustainable harvest from the same trees over generations, ensuring that winter's demand for firewood didn't exhaust the local supply. Religious observances adapted to incorporate winter survival needs while maintaining spiritual significance. The great midwinter festival that Romans had celebrated as Saturnalia underwent transformation as Christianity spread, eventually emerging as Christmas. Yet beneath the theological shifts, practical winter considerations remained. These celebrations coincided with the slaughter of animals that could not be fed through winter, creating a rare opportunity for fresh meat consumption, when most communities subsisted on preserved foods. The timing also fell when beer and wine from the autumn harvest had completed fermentation, providing both celebration and crucial calories during the season of greatest scarcity. As darkness fell early on winter evenings, families would gather around the central hearth not just for warmth, but for communal activities essential to survival. Women spun wool into thread by the flickering firelight, men repaired tools in preparation for spring, and elders passed down the stories and knowledge that would ensure the community's continuation. In these firelit gatherings, we can glimpse the origins of traditions that would echo through the centuries ahead. The centrality of the hearth in northern European culture, the importance of handcrafts during winter months, and the crucial role of oral tradition in preserving knowledge when daylight hours were too precious to use for anything but essential outdoor tasks. This post-Roman adaptation to winter was not a simple regression to primitive conditions, but rather a sophisticated synthesis of inherited Roman techniques, indigenous knowledge, and innovations born of necessity. Communities became more self-sufficient by necessity, yet maintained connections that allowed the sharing of vital winter resources when local supplies failed. The resulting winter survival strategies shaped not only the material culture of early medieval Europe, but its emerging social structures as communities organized themselves around the fundamental challenge of surviving the cold months with sufficient resources to plant again in spring. For medieval people, winter survival began not with the first snowfall, but with the first seeds planted in spring. The entire agricultural year formed an unbroken circle of preparation for the lean months when fields lay dormant under frost and snow. From the thawing days of early March to the harvest festivals of autumn, every decision, every labour was made with the shadow of winter hanging over it, not as a distant threat, but as an inevitable reality requiring constant forethought. The agricultural calendar that governed medieval life varied somewhat by region, but its basic rhythm remained consistent across much of Europe. Medieval farmers recognized this cycle through a series of feast days that marked critical agricultural transitions. Candlemas, February 2nd, traditionally signalled the time to prepare ploughs and harnesses. St. Gregory's Day, March the 12th, marked the beginning of spring planting in many regions. The feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24th, came at the height of summer growth. Lammas, August 1st, celebrated the first harvest, while Michaelmas, September 29th, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of serious winter preparations. Behind these religious observances lay practical knowledge accumulated across generations. Medieval farmers tracked subtle environmental signals, the behaviour of birds, the flowering of certain plants, the quality of light at sunset. They knew that swallows departing early often presaged a harsh winter. They observed how thick the husks grew on grain, how deeply squirrels buried nuts, how heavily furred rabbits became. A medieval proverb counselled, "When berries grow abundant and thick, the coming winter will pile snow deep." These observations helped communities gauge the urgency of their preparations. Spring planting decisions were the first step in winter preparation. Fields were carefully allocated between immediate needs and long-term security. Even while sowing spring crops, farmers reserved their best land for winter wheat and rye-hardy grains that would be planted in autumn and lie dormant through winter before providing the earliest harvest the following summer. The exact balance between spring and winter grains varied by region, with northern areas generally favouring spring planting due to harsh winters that could kill winter crops. Throughout summer, as crops grew tall in the fields, other winter preparations continued without pause. Women and children gathered wild plants with medicinal properties, chamomile for fevers, yarrow for wounds, elderflowers for coughs that would inevitably come with winter's chill. These plants were carefully dried in bundles hanging from cottage rafters, their pungent scents filling homes through late summer. Special attention went to plants that could treat winter ailments: horehound and coltsfoot for coughs, willow bark for pain and fever, valerian root for sleeplessness during long winter nights. Beekeeping took on special significance during summer months. Honey provided not just sweetness but crucial calories during winter scarcity. More importantly, the wax would be formed into candles, precious sources of light during winter's long darkness. A well-managed hive might produce enough wax for several dozen candles, a treasure in an era when light was precious and expensive. Careful households rationed these candles strictly, often working by firelight alone on all but the most important occasions. Summer also brought the gathering of materials for winter clothing and bedding. Sheep were shorn, their wool washed, carded, and spun into thread that would become warm garments before winter arrived. Flax plants were harvested, retted in ponds until their fibres separated, then dried, broken, scutched, and hackled, a labour-intensive process that transformed plants into linen thread. While linen itself provided little warmth, it created the base layer for winter clothing, protecting skin from the itch of wool garments worn above. Even children participated in winter preparation, gathering nuts and berries through summer months, carefully drying them on sunlit rocks or stringing them on threads suspended near the hearth. These would provide vital nutrients during months when fresh produce became a distant memory. Households with access to bees and sufficient honey might preserve summer berries in honey, creating rare sweet treats reserved for the darkest days of winter when spirits needed lifting. As summer waned and autumn approached, the pace of winter preparations intensified dramatically. Harvest time demanded all available hands, from the youngest child capable of gleaning fallen grain to the eldest grandparent, who could still bind sheaves or watch for birds that might steal precious seeds. The grain harvest represented life itself. Successful storage meant survival, while failure meant hunger or even starvation before spring returned. Threshing followed immediately, separating grain from chaff through hours of rhythmic labour with flail and winnowing basket. The precious kernels were then dried, thoroughly crucial for preventing mould during storage, and placed in sealed containers. In northern regions, grain might be parched near fires before storage, the slight toasting helping prevent spoilage in damp winter conditions. Wealthier households stored grain in purpose-built granaries raised on stone mushrooms that prevented rodents from climbing up, while humbler families might keep their grain supply in sealed chests or pottery vessels. Autumn brought the slaughter season, a critical period in winter preparation. Livestock that couldn't be fed through winter were butchered in late October through November, when cool temperatures aided preservation efforts. This timing wasn't arbitrary. It allowed meat to be preserved without spoilage while ensuring that valuable feed wasn't wasted on animals that would otherwise compete with humans for winter sustenance. Only breeding stock and animals that provided ongoing value milk cows, oxen for spring ploughing, chickens for eggs, were kept through the winter months. The preservation of this meat involved multiple techniques developed over centuries. Pork, the most common meat preserved for winter, was often salted, with special attention paid to the quality and quantity of salt used. The meat might then be smoked over fires of specific woods chosen for their flavour and preservative properties, oak, apple or cherry being particularly valued. Beef was more commonly dried or made into heavily salted dried strips. In mountain regions with reliably cold temperatures, some communities created air cellars, protected outdoor spaces where winter temperatures naturally preserved meat in a frozen state. Vegetables required different preservation approaches. Cabbages were fermented into sauerkraut in wooden barrels. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots and beets were stored in cool, damp cellars, or sometimes in outdoor clamps mounds of straw, earth, and sometimes sand that insulated the vegetables from freezing while allowing enough coolness to prevent spoilage. Onions and garlic were braided into strings and hung from rafters, while herbs were dried in bundles, their diminishing fragrance through winter a reminder of summer's abundance. Firewood, the literal fuel of winter survival, demanded tremendous forethought. Medieval communities typically began gathering their winter wood supply as early as spring, cutting logs that would season through summer months. Greenwood burned poorly and produced excessive smoke, potentially causing respiratory ailments when used in confined winter quarters. Properly seasoned wood cut, split and dried for months, burned cleaner, hotter, and more efficiently. A medieval household might require 20-30 cords of wood to survive a northern winter, representing hundreds of hours of labour. As autumn deepened toward winter, homes themselves became the focus of preparation. Drafty walls received fresh applications of dauber mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung that sealed cracks against winter winds. Roofs were repaired with new thatch or shingles before snow could render such work impossible. In areas with access to animal skins, windows might be covered with scraped hides that allowed sunlight to filter through while blocking wind. Wealthier homes might use oiled parchment, while the poorest simply stuffed straw into window openings during the coldest months. By winter solstice, the medieval household had completed its circle of preparation. The success of these efforts would now be tested against whatever hardships the season brought. Those who had prepared well faced winter, not with panic but with measured concern, watching their stores and adjusting consumption based on how long cold conditions persisted. They understood what modern people often forget, that nature's cycles demand not just labour in the moment, but constant thoughtful preparation for seasons yet to come. In the challenging landscape of early medieval Europe, where winter's grip could last half the year, survival depended on shelter as much as on food stores. The homes that dotted the countryside between the 6th and 9th centuries represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about keeping warm in a world where heat was precious, and always in danger of escaping into the frigid air. The central hearth formed the literal and metaphorical heart of every early medieval dwelling. Unlike the fireplaces that would develop in later centuries, these hearths were open fire pits positioned in the centre of the main room, with smoke rising toward a small opening in the roof. This arrangement, though seemingly primitive to modern sensibilities, offered significant practical advantages. The central position allowed heat to radiate in all directions rather than being lost through an exterior wall. Families would arrange their daily activities in a circle around this life-sustaining flame, their shadows dancing on walls as daylight faded and winter nights lengthened. Above the hearth, the rising column of warm air created a natural convection current that circulated through the dwelling. Smoke accumulated in the upper reaches of the structure before finding its way out through a hole in the roof, often called a louver. This smoke-filled upper zone, though uncomfortable for humans, served a crucial purpose. It seasoned the wooden roof beams, making them resistant to insects and rot. The same smoke that watered eyes and occasionally sent people into coughing fits was actively preserving the structure that sheltered them. Fuel management became a science unto itself during these early medieval winters. Different woods burned with different qualities. Oak and beech provided long-lasting hot coals ideal for overnight burning. Pine and fir caught quickly, but burned away rapidly, useful for morning fires when quick heat was needed. Rural families might spend much of autumn gathering, cutting and stacking their winter fuel supply. A household in northern Europe could require 20 to 30 cartloads of wood to survive a single winter. When wood grew scarce, as it often did in heavily settled areas or during particularly harsh seasons, people turned to alternatives: dried peat cut from bogs, twisted bundles of straw, dried dung, or even dried seaweed in coastal regions. The buildings themselves reflected generations of adaptation to winter conditions. In the Germanic regions of northern Europe, the traditional longhouse provided the most common dwelling. These rectangular structures, typically 15 to 25 feet wide and anywhere from 20 to over 100 feet long, were built around sturdy timber frames with walls of wattle and dauber matrix of woven sticks covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. This composite material provided surprising insulation value, particularly when freshly maintained. Each autumn, families would inspect their walls, patching holes and cracks that had developed during the previous year, sealing their homes against the coming cold. Roofs presented a critical challenge for winter survival. While southern European traditions favoured tiles, the northern regions relied primarily on thatch bundles of reeds, straw, or other plant materials densely packed and expertly arranged to shed water and snow. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years or more and provided excellent insulation. The steep pitch common to northern buildings allowed snow to slide off rather than accumulate, preventing the crushing weight that could collapse a structure. The thick mass of organic material trapped air, creating an insulating layer that kept precious heat from escaping through the top of the dwelling. Windows, as we understand them today, were rare luxuries. Glass remained prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest households until much later in the medieval period. Instead, most dwellings featured small openings that could be covered with oiled parchment, which allowed sunlight through while blocking wind. Wooden shutters, closed during the worst weather, or simply stuffed with straw or cloth when temperatures dropped. These measures created darker interiors but preserved the warmth that meant survival. Floors in most early medieval homes remained earthen, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that was periodically renewed. While this might seem cold underfoot, the packed earth actually provided better insulation than raised wooden floors would have, as it connected to the relatively stable temperature of the ground below, rather than exposing the dwelling to frigid air underneath. In some regions, livestock would be kept in a slightly lower section of the same building during winter, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth, while the slight elevation difference kept human living areas somewhat separated. Indeed, the integration of animals into human living spaces represented one of the most practical winter adaptations. A single cow generates roughly the same heat as a small modern space heater, making livestock valuable not only for their milk, meat and labour, but for their thermal output. In the most modest dwellings, people and animals might share a single room during the coldest months. More substantial farmhouses often featured a byre, animal shelter, at one end of the longhouse, separated from human quarters by only a partial wall or screen. The arrangement benefited both parties. Humans gained warmth, while animals received shelter and regular attention. Sleep arrangements further reflected the need for communal warmth. Individual bedrooms were unheard of except among the highest nobility. Instead, family members slept together on shared platforms or pallets, often elevated slightly from the floor to escape drafts. Multiple generations might sleep under the same coverings of fur, wool, and linen, sharing body heat through the night. Servants or slaves in wealthier households typically slept near the hearth, both to tend it through the night and to benefit from its direct warmth. The most sophisticated early medieval dwellings incorporated passive solar heating principles, though the builders would not have used such terminology. Structures were typically oriented to capture maximum southern exposure, with fewer and smaller openings on the north-facing walls. In some regions, a slight berm of earth might be piled against northern walls, providing additional insulation against the prevailing winter winds. These features were not innovations, but represented traditional knowledge passed down through generations of observation. For most early medieval Europeans, winter comfort was relative and communal rather than absolute and individual. The interior temperatures of dwellings during winter months would be considered uncomfortably cold by modern standards, perhaps 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit, 10-13 Celsius, in the main living area during the day, and considerably cooler away from the hearth or during the night. People adapted through clothing rather than expecting to heat entire spaces to comfortable temperatures. Multiple layers of wool and linen, often topped with furs for those who could afford them, served as personal insulation. The heaviest garments were saved for outdoor activities, while indoor clothing remained somewhat lighter, but still substantial by modern standards. The early medieval approach to winter shelter reflected a fundamentally different relationship with cold than we maintain today. Rather than attempting to create summer conditions year-round as modern heating systems do, medieval people accepted seasonal variations in comfort as inevitable. They focused on maintaining a critical thermal boundary, not necessarily keeping spaces warm by contemporary standards, but ensuring they never fell below the threshold where hypothermia threatened. This pragmatic approach allowed communities to survive with limited resources through even the harshest winters, huddled around central hearths that served as both literal and symbolic centres of warmth, light, and life during the darkest months of the year. As the last autumn leaves surrendered to winter's advance, medieval communities faced not only the threat of cold and hunger, but also a season of distinctive maladies. Winter imposed its own medical calendar upon the medieval world, bringing ailments as predictable as the frost. In the damp chill of stone-walled dwellings and the close quarters necessitated by winter's retreat indoors, illness found fertile ground to spread from person to person with alarming efficiency. Respiratory afflictions dominated the winter health landscape. The medieval person recognized the familiar progression of what they called winter fever, or chest catarrh, what we now know as the common cold, influenza, and bronchitis. Without understanding of viral or bacterial causes, they attributed these conditions to an imbalance of bodily humours disturbed by winter's cold and dampness. The theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, provided the conceptual framework for understanding all illness, with winter particularly associated with excess phlegm, thought to accumulate in the chest and lungs. Coughing echoed through medieval settlements during winter months, from the persistent dry hack of bronchial inflammation to the deep wet cough of what they called lung rot, likely pneumonia in many cases. This latter condition was particularly feared, as its progression often led to death, especially among the elderly and very young. Medieval medical texts describe the telling signs: difficulty breathing, pain in the chest, fever that rose at night, and sputum tinged with blood. Without antibiotics, pneumonia claimed countless lives each winter, particularly during colder years when fuel shortages left many shivering in inadequately heated homes. The enclosed environments of winter living also fostered conditions that modern medicine would recognize as tuberculosis, then called consumption or phthisis. This chronic infection might smoulder through a community for years, but often worsened in winter when immune systems weakened from poor nutrition and lack of sunlight. Its victims gradually wasted away, their persistent coughs producing blood-flecked sputum, their skin developing an almost translucent pallor. Medieval healers considered this condition almost invariably fatal, though its progression might extend over many winters. Beyond respiratory complaints, winter brought joint pain to the medieval population, particularly among the elderly and those whose occupations exposed them to the elements. What they called joint ill or bone ache likely encompassed arthritis, rheumatism, and the bone pain associated with vitamin D deficiency, the latter especially common during the sunlight-scarce northern European winter. Labourers, whose hands remained wet and cold during outdoor work, suffered from painful swelling and cracking of the skin, a condition they referred to as winter hands. Chilblains, painful inflammations of small blood vessels in the extremities, tormented those whose limbs were repeatedly exposed to cold without actually freezing. These angry red or purplish swellings on fingers, toes, ears and noses itched intolerably when warmed, leading to the medieval observation that winter's bite stings worst by the fire. More severe cold exposure led to frostbite called winter death in some regions, the literal necrosis of extremities that often necessitated amputation when spring's warmer temperatures revealed the full extent of winter's damage. The scarcity of fresh produce during winter months led to nutritional deficiencies that manifested in various ways. By late winter, many people developed symptoms we now recognize as scurvy, bleeding gums, loosened teeth, joint pain, and slow-healing wounds. Medieval healers observed these patterns without understanding the underlying vitamin C deficiency, attributing them instead to winter blood, becoming thin and weak until spring's fresh greens could restore its vitality. To combat these seasonal afflictions, medieval communities developed a sophisticated pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies, prepared during the growing season and carefully preserved for winter use. Monasteries in particular maintained extensive physic gardens and carefully documented medicinal preparations. The herb room or still room of a well-prepared household contained dried plants suspended from rafters, powders and oils in sealed containers, and tinctures in stoppered glass vessels, all awaiting winter's inevitable medical emergencies. For respiratory ailments, several plant remedies proved genuinely effective. Garlic consumed raw or prepared in syrups offered antimicrobial properties. Thyme, either dried for tea or burned as an aromatic, contained compounds that helped ease bronchial congestion. Horehound, carefully harvested in summer and preserved as lozenges with honey, provided relief for persistent coughs. The aromatic oils of plants like rosemary and eucalyptus, the latter available only in southern regions, were added to steaming water, allowing sufferers to inhale the vapours and experience temporary relief from congestion. More severe respiratory infections might be treated with poultices applied to the chest. These typically contained mustard seed, which stimulated blood flow to the area, creating a warming sensation and drawing heat to the infection site. While modern medicine would question their curative properties, these treatments often provided comfort and symptom relief. Honey, mixed with various herbs or sometimes simply taken by the spoonful, soothed irritated throats and may have provided genuine antimicrobial benefits. For joint pain and the bone aches of winter, external applications predominated. Compresses using vinegar infused with anti-inflammatory herbs like meadowsweet, which naturally contains salicylic compounds similar to aspirin, could reduce pain and swelling. Willow bark, brewed into a bitter tea, offered similar relief when taken internally. For the pain of chilblains, medieval healers recommended applications of aloe vera, animal fats, or even urine, the latter actually containing urea, which modern medicine recognizes as an effective skin softener. Beyond herbal remedies, other therapeutic approaches aim to restore the body's humoral balance disrupted by winter. Controlled bleeding through leeches or direct bloodletting was thought to relieve the excess of certain humours, though modern medicine recognizes the dangers of such practices, particularly for already weakened patients. More beneficial were the recommendations for gentle exercises, deep breathing in clean air away from smoky interiors, and careful attention to maintaining warmth without becoming overheated. Religious and spiritual healing practices complemented physical remedies. Prayers to healing saints, particularly St. Blaise for throat ailments, and St. Benedict for protection against poisoning and infectious disease, were integrated with medical care. In many communities, the local priest might bless the sick person's throat with crossed candles on St. Blaise's feast day, February 3rd, seeking divine intervention against winter's respiratory afflictions. Winter diseases held particular dread because they struck when communities were already at their most vulnerable. A family's provider weakened by illness might be unable to gather essential firewood. A nursing mother suffering from winter fever might struggle to produce sufficient milk for her infant. The interconnected vulnerabilities of the cold season meant that medical knowledge was not merely specialized wisdom, but essential community knowledge shared across generations. By necessity, medieval people developed a nuanced understanding of winter's effects on the body, though their explanatory frameworks differed from modern medicine. Their observational skills and practical approaches to prevention and treatment represented a sophisticated response to seasonal health challenges. Their medical traditions, preserved in manuscripts and oral teaching, would serve as the foundation for increasingly systematic approaches to winter health in subsequent centuries, even as the fundamental challenges of surviving winter illness remained remarkably consistent across the medieval millennium. Of all the regions in medieval Europe, none faced winter's challenge more squarely than the northern lands. From Scandinavia to the Baltic shores, from Iceland to the northern Russian territories, communities developed winter survival techniques of unmatched sophistication. Unlike their southern counterparts who might experience a few months of mild chill, these northern peoples endured winters that transformed their entire world seas, froze solid, snow-buried landscapes for half the year, and darkness claimed most of the day during the deepest winter months. The Norse and their neighbouring peoples approached winter not as an enemy to be feared, but as a harsh yet familiar companion. Their dwellings reflected generations of accumulated wisdom about heat retention. The longhouse, that iconic structure of Nordic settlement, represented perhaps the most efficient winter shelter in medieval Europe. Unlike the draughty great halls of more southerly nobles, these buildings featured thick walls built of substantial timbers, often a metre thick, with every crack meticulously sealed with moss, clay, and animal hair. The roof sloped steeply, allowing snow to slide off rather than accumulate and risk collapse under winter's heavy weight. Inside these longhouses, the central hearth provided not merely cooking facilities, but the primary heat source. Unlike the southern European tendency toward wall fireplaces that sent much of their warmth up the chimney, this central position allowed heat to radiate in all directions. Smoke escaped through a small opening in the roof, passing first through the upper reaches of the interior where it warmed the sleeping lofts. Families arranged their living and sleeping spaces around this heat source, with benches along the walls serving as seating during the day and sleeping platforms at night. The most honoured members of the household slept closest to the fire, while servants and lower-status individuals made do with the cooler ends of the building. In Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, builders took the further step of partially burying their dwellings, using Earth's natural insulating properties. With walls of turf up to 6 feet thick, these structures maintained remarkably stable interior temperatures even when fierce winter storms raged outside. Archaeological excavations have revealed that some turf houses maintained interior temperatures around 50-60 degrees and 10-15 C, while outside temperatures plunged far below freezing. An astonishing feat of insulation without modern technology. Northern European winter clothing surpassed southern traditions in both sophistication and effectiveness. While a southern European might add a layer of wool to their normal attire during colder months, Norse peoples developed complete winter wardrobes of remarkable ingenuity. Starting with an inner layer of linen to wick moisture away from the skin, they added multiple wool layers, each providing additional insulation. The outer garments were often treated with beeswax or animal fats to repel moisture, as getting wet in sub-freezing temperatures meant almost certain death. Fur played a crucial role in extreme cold protection, with bear, wolf, fox, and seal pelts prized for their insulating qualities. Fur-lined hoods protected the face from biting winds, while mittens rather than gloves with separated fingers kept hands warmer by allowing fingers to share heat. Perhaps most ingenious were the winter boots, often made with separate layers, an inner sock of wool or fur, a middle layer of insulating material, and an outer layer of waterproofed leather. Some northern communities stuffed their winter boots with dried grass or moss that provided additional insulation and could be replaced when damp. The northern Europeans transformed winter's greatest challenge, mobility through snow and ice, into a unique advantage through technological innovation. While southern armies and merchants found themselves largely immobilized by winter conditions, Norse peoples developed equipment allowing efficient travel across frozen landscapes. Skis, already in use by the early medieval period, provided swift movement across snow-covered terrain. Archaeological finds include skis over 6 feet long, often asymmetrical with one ski longer than the other for improved steering. Ski poles, typically a single long staff, aided balance and propulsion. For heavier transport, sleds and sledges enabled the movement of goods with less effort than wheeled vehicles required on snow-free ground. The frozen rivers and lakes that had been summer obstacles became winter highways, allowing direct travel routes unavailable during warmer months. This winter mobility gave northern peoples strategic advantages in warfare, with Norse sagas recording numerous winter raids that caught victims unprepared, believing themselves protected by winter's isolation. Fishing through ice became a critical winter survival skill. Using iron augers to cut through frozen lakes and rivers, northern communities maintained access to protein sources when hunting grew difficult and stored foods began running low. Special spears and nets designed specifically for ice fishing allowed families to supplement their winter diets with fresh food during the leanest months. In coastal areas, communities tracked the breathing holes of seals, waiting patiently for hours until the animals surfaced for air before striking with specialized harpoons. Winter food storage reached remarkable sophistication in these northern regions. Root cellars dug deep into the earth-stored vegetables at temperatures just above freezing, while meats were preserved through multiple methods. Beyond the smoking and salting common throughout Europe, northern peoples perfected freeze-drying techniques, hanging thin strips of meat outside in the dry winter air until all moisture had been removed. The resulting product could last for years if properly stored. Fermentation preserved cabbage as sauerkraut, providing crucial vitamin C during months when fresh produce was unavailable. Perhaps most distinctive was the northern European cultural adaptation to winter's darkness and confinement. Rather than merely enduring the long nights, these societies developed rich traditions of storytelling, music, and handcrafts, specifically associated with winter evenings. The figure of the sagaman or storyteller gained particular importance, preserving oral histories and entertaining households through the darkest months. Women taught daughters intricate textile arts by firelight, while men carved wood or worked with bone and antler to create both practical items and decorative pieces. This cultural richness reflected a profound psychological adaptation, the transformation of winter from a time of deprivation to a season of creativity, communal bonding, and knowledge transmission. The Norse concept of hygge, a sense of coziness, comfort, and well-being through simple pleasures, long predated its modern popularity, representing generations of wisdom about surviving winter not merely physically, but mentally and emotionally. As we explore the varied responses to winter across medieval Europe, these northern adaptations represent perhaps the pinnacle of winter survival. Knowledge, techniques, and technologies developed over centuries that allowed human communities to thrive in environments that might otherwise have proven lethal. Their innovations would gradually spread southward, influencing winter practices throughout Europe and leaving a legacy that extends into our modern understanding of cold weather survival. While peasant villages and noble estates endured winter's grip across medieval Europe, another institution weathered the cold months with distinctive rhythms and remarkable resilience: monasteries. Those islands of literacy, prayer, and structured living followed winter patterns uniquely their own, shaped by religious observance yet acutely practical in their approach to the season's challenges. These communities, whether humble establishments with a dozen brothers or vast complexes housing hundreds, represented perhaps medieval Europe's most sophisticated response to winter's trials. The Rule of St. Benedict, foundation document for Western monasticism, acknowledged winter's impact directly, adjusting the community's daily schedule with the changing seasons. During winter months, monks rose later, though still well before dawn by modern standards, recognizing the body's need for additional rest during darkness. From November until Easter, stated the rule, the 8th hour of the night is a reasonable time to rise, so that the brothers may sleep slightly longer than half the night. This pragmatic concession to winter's darkness reveals the measured practicality that characterized monastic approaches to the season. The physical layout of most monasteries reflected deep understanding of winter's challenges. Cloisters, those covered walkways surrounding an open courtyard, allowed monks to move between buildings without fully exposing themselves to the elements. Infirmary buildings typically occupied the sunniest locations within the complex, maximizing natural warmth for the ill and elderly. Kitchens and refectories, dining halls, were often positioned to benefit from the heat of cooking fires, while scriptorium windows faced north when possible, providing steady light without direct sun glare. Particularly important during winter months when parchment production and manuscript copying continued unabated. Heating a monastery required careful planning and considerable resources. The Cistercian Abbey of Fountains in Yorkshire consumed over 260 cartloads of firewood annually, with most burned during winter months. Unlike secular halls where a central hearth might warm a single space, monasteries needed to heat multiple areas: the chapter house where daily business was conducted, the warming room, calefactory, where monks might briefly thaw frozen fingers, the infirmary for the sick, and sometimes the scriptorium where intellectual work continued. Most dormitories, however, remained unheated, with monks sleeping fully clothed under layers of woolen blankets, often with nightcaps pulled down over their ears against the cold. The monastic day maintained its rhythms regardless of season. The Divine Office 8 prayer services spaced throughout day and night continued through the deepest cold, though medieval chronicles occasionally note that extreme weather might necessitate combining certain nighttime offices to avoid dangerous exposure. The transition from bed to cold stone chapel floors for night prayers represented one of winter's particular mortifications, as the Benedictine monk Orderic Vitalis lamented, describing brothers trembling with cold as they chanted their nocturnal prayers. Winter brought changes to monastic diets, though less dramatically than in secular households. Most established monasteries maintained sophisticated storage systems, root cellars, granaries, and smokehouses that ensured relatively consistent provisions throughout the year. The Benedictine rule allowed for practical adaptations. From the Feast of Holy Cross, September 14th, until the beginning of Lent, the brothers will eat at the 9th hour about 3 p.m., establishing a single main meal during winter months rather than the 2 meals permitted during warmer seasons. This adjustment both conserved food supplies and acknowledged the body's different needs during colder weather. Winter's long darkness offered monasteries extended hours for indoor activities uniquely suited to their mission. Manuscript production flourished during these months, with scriptoria becoming centres of focused activity. Monks laboured over texts by daylight and sometimes candlelight, though the latter remained carefully rationed given the expense of wax. Parchment making, the processing of animal skins into writing surfaces, was ideally suited to winter, as the cold weather reduced problems with insects and decay during the curing process. Many of the magnificent illuminated manuscripts that survive today took shape during long winter months, their gold leaf and vivid pigments capturing candle flame and transforming it into permanent light on the page. The winter season prompted specific charitable obligations for monastic communities. Most monasteries increased their almsgiving during cold months, providing food for the poor and occasionally shelter for travellers stranded by winter conditions. The Cistercian houses were particularly known for their winter charity, with their customary declaring, "From the 1st of November until Easter, all guests who come shall be offered soup and bread at the door." Chronicles from Bury St. Edmonds record extraordinary measures during particularly harsh winters, such as in 1314 when the abbey fed upwards of 4,000 poor during the months of extreme cold and famine that gripped much of Europe. Medical care adapted to winter-specific ailments. Monastic infirmaries developed specialized treatments for chilblains, frostbite, and winter fevers. Herbal preparations of mustard, ginger, and pepper warming by nature, according to medieval medical theory, were prescribed for cold-related complaints. The infirmary typically maintained its own kitchen where special therapeutic foods could be prepared for the ill. Infirmarians paid particular attention to elderly monks during winter months, recognizing their vulnerability to both cold and the respiratory ailments that spread in enclosed, heated spaces. Despite winter's hardships, monastic chronicles and records reveal the season's spiritual significance. The liturgical calendar placed major feasts, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas during winter's darkest period, creating a rhythm of celebration amid austerity. The symbolism of light overcoming darkness found physical expression in the hundreds of candles that might illuminate a monastery church during these winter celebrations, transforming the cold stone into a haven of warmth and light, if only temporarily. Winter brought practical challenges but also opportunities for deeper contemplation. John of Fécamp, an 11th century Benedictine abbot, wrote that winter taught patience and perseverance, virtues central to monastic life. As the earth seems dead yet holds within it the sleeping seeds of spring, so too our souls in winter's trial. The seasonal cycle of darkness yielding eventually to light echoed the spiritual journey, making winter not merely a physical hardship but a metaphor for faith itself. Perhaps most remarkably, monasteries maintained their essential continuity through winter after winter, century after century. When snow-buried villages and ice-locked castle gates, the rhythmic chanting of prayers continued rising from monastery churches across Europe. This persistence through season after season, this unbroken chain of observance regardless of weather, formed part of monasticism's profound appeal, the creation of a human institution that, like the seasons themselves, moved through time with a regularity that transcended individual lives. While peasants huddled in smoky cottages and monks chanted in chilly cloisters, the medieval nobility experienced winter through a different lens, one coloured by privilege yet still shaped by season's harsh realities. Royal courts across medieval Europe developed distinctive rhythms and traditions for the winter months, transforming what was a time of privation for many into a season of political consolidation, lavish entertainment, and strategic planning behind protective stone walls. Winter fundamentally altered the patterns of royal and aristocratic life. During the warmer months, medieval monarchs typically practiced what historians call itinerant kingship, travelling constantly between royal estates, consuming the stockpiled resources of each before moving to the next. This perpetual progress served multiple purposes. It allowed the king to be seen throughout his realm, dispensed justice in person, and avoided depleting any single estate's provisions. With winter's arrival, however, this nomadic pattern necessarily slowed. Roads became impassable quagmires or disappeared entirely beneath snowdrifts. The royal household would settle into one of several favoured winter residences, often those best suited for the season through a combination of strategic location, robust construction, and substantial storehouses. The choice of winter residence revealed much about a particular monarchy's priorities and challenges. English kings often wintered at Westminster, where the Thames provided easier transportation than muddy roads. French monarchs increasingly favoured Paris with its growing urban amenities. In the Germanic lands, rulers might retreat to the Rhineland, where milder weather prevailed compared to the harsher continental interior. The Scandinavian royalty, accustomed to more extreme conditions, developed specialised winter courts at Uppsala in Sweden and Trondheim in Norway, where great halls with central hearths accommodated hundreds during ceremonial feasts that helped sustain communal bonds through the darkest months. The physical transformation of these royal residences for winter was considerable. Great halls that might be sparsely furnished during summer campaigns became decorated spaces hung with tapestries serving both decorative and insulating purposes. These massive textile works depicting hunting scenes, biblical stories, or legendary exploits helped trap heat, while providing colour during the monochromatic winter months. Rushes and herbs strewn on floors were refreshed with aromatic varieties that masked the inevitable mustiness of enclosed spaces. In the more sophisticated courts of the later medieval period, window openings received waxed linen coverings, or even glass panes, luxuries unimaginable in commoners' dwellings. Winter preparation in royal households operated on a scale that dwarfed the efforts of ordinary communities. Castle stewards maintained meticulous records of provisions required to sustain not just the royal family, but their entire retinue through winter. The wardrobe accounts of Edward III of England from the late 13th century reveal staggering quantities. Thousands of gallons of wine, hundreds of cattle and pigs slaughtered and preserved, tons of firewood stacked in castle yards. Special ice houses preserved perishable delicacies for royal tables, while castle gardens sometimes featured sheltered sections where herbs might be protected from frost for royal physicians' use. The political rhythm of medieval kingdoms shifted decisively with the changing seasons. Summer was for warfare campaigns launched when roads were passable, and fields could feed armies on the march. Winter, by contrast, became the season for governance and diplomacy. With military operations largely suspended, kings convened councils, heard petitions, and issued charters and laws. The great Christmas courts of Norman and Angevin England exemplified this pattern. For 12 days surrounding the winter solstice, the realm's most powerful nobles gathered around the king, reaffirming loyalties, settling disputes, arranging marriages, and forming alliances that would shape the coming year's events. These winter courts served as crucibles of medieval political culture. Here, ambitious nobles competed for royal favour through displays of largesse, cultural patronage, and conspicuous consumption. The exchange of winter gifts became politically charged performances, the value and thoughtfulness of presents indicating one's standing and influence. Chronicles describe Henry II of England receiving hunting falcons from the King of Norway, spiced wines from Aquitaine, and furs from Irish chieftains during his Christmas courts, each gift acknowledging his authority while establishing or reinforcing diplomatic connections. Winter entertainment took distinctive forms in these rarefied settings. The great halls of royal castles witnessed elaborate performances unlikely to be seen elsewhere. Minstrels and troubadours, seeking winter patronage away from the summer tournament circuit, performed the latest chansons de geste and courtly romances. Chess and backgammon games requiring expensive boards and pieces entertained nobles during long evenings. Courts with particular cultural aspirations might enjoy the performances of acrobats, trained animals, or even early theatrical representations of biblical stories. Hunting remained the quintessential aristocratic activity even in winter's grip. Unlike summer hunts, conducted partly for provisions and partly for sport, winter hunting served primarily as elite masculine ritual and political bonding exercise. Special techniques developed for tracking deer and boar through snow. The 12th century text, The Art of Venery, details how different snow conditions affected tracking, how to identify the age and sex of deer from their tracks in snow, and how to coordinate hunters in winter conditions. Kings used these hunts strategically, with invitations signalling favour and exclusions marking political cooling. A day spent pursuing boar alongside the monarch provided unmatched access for ambitious courtiers. For royal women, winter brought both restrictions and opportunities. Queens and noble ladies found their mobility even more constrained than usual, but the settled nature of winter courts allowed for different forms of political influence. In the comparative privacy of winter residences, queens often exercised significant informal power through private conversation and counsel with their husbands. The historical record reveals that many significant royal grants and decisions bearing midwinter dates came at the urging of queens who had their husband's ear during these more intimate seasons. Female-dominated spaces like chambers and solar rooms, often better heated than the draughty great halls, became important sites of political discussion and alliance-building among the women who shaped medieval politics from positions of nominal exclusion. Winter's impact extended even to royal justice and administration. Legal records from across medieval Europe show distinct seasonal patterns, with increased judicial activity during winter months, when royal officials were less occupied with military matters. Winter sessions of emerging parliamentary bodies became more common over time, as did the issuance of important charters and laws during the season of enforced settlement. The Magna Carta's predecessor, the Charter of Liberties, was issued by Henry the Faun during Christmas Court in 1100, while numerous other foundational documents of medieval governance bear winter dates. As winter gave way to spring, these royal winter establishments would gradually disperse. The coming campaign season would see kings return to fields and frontiers, noble retinues scatter to their own estates, and the intense political concentration of the winter court dissolve until the following year. Yet the relationships formed, agreements reached, and tensions surfaced during these winter gatherings would shape the medieval political landscape long after the snow had melted. For all their privilege and protection from winter's harshest physical effects, medieval royalty remained as bound to the seasonal rhythm as the humblest cottager. their power substantial but never sufficient to overcome winter's fundamental transformation of human activity. While winter transformed medieval landscapes into seemingly dormant worlds of white and grey, the vital flow of goods and people never entirely ceased. Indeed, the changing seasons created not simply obstacles but alternative pathways and opportunities that resourceful medieval societies incorporated into their annual rhythms of commerce and travel. The freezing temperatures that threatened life also created new possibilities for movement across otherwise impassable terrain. Winter dramatically altered the navigability of waterways that served as medieval Europe's primary commercial arteries. Rivers that facilitated easy transportation during warmer months might become impassable barriers when choked with ice flows, or paradoxically transform into smooth highways when frozen solid enough to bear weight. The Rhine, Seine, Thames, and countless smaller waterways experienced this seasonal metamorphosis, requiring merchants and travellers to adapt their strategies with each temperature shift. Records from the 13th century describe Scandinavian merchants travelling across the frozen Baltic Sea, using their ships as sledges pulled by horses across the ice, an ingenious adaptation that maintained vital trade links when conventional sailing proved impossible. Merchant communities carefully monitored the patterns of freezing, developing sophisticated knowledge of which waterways froze completely, which remained dangerously partial with treacherous thin spots, and which stayed navigable throughout winter due to swift currents or salt content. A Merchant Guild document from 14th century Lübeck provides detailed guidance on identifying safe ice crossings. Look for where locals have marked paths with pine branches, and test questionable ice with an axe before leading your horse upon it. The sound of solid ice differs from that which may break. The timing of freeze and thaw became crucial knowledge for planning trade expeditions. Harbour records from medieval London show intensive shipping activity immediately before the Thames typically began freezing, as merchants rushed to complete final voyages. Similarly, harbour masters' accounts reveal surges of activity during midwinter thaws, when ships quickly took advantage of temporary navigability to move goods that had accumulated during frozen periods. On land, winter conditions created their own peculiar advantages and challenges for transportation. The freezing of muddy tracks that had been nearly impassable quagmires during autumn rains transformed them into relatively smooth, hard surfaces ideal for sledge transport. A German merchant's account from 1387 notes, "The heavy snows near Frankfurt proved a blessing, as our sledges moved across the frozen road that had trapped wagons to their axles just 3 weeks prior. Heavy goods like stone, timber, and iron, costly to transport during other seasons, could be moved more efficiently over snow and ice, using sledges that required far less draft animal power than wheeled vehicles on soft ground." Pack animals faced particular challenges during winter journeys. Horses, the preferred transport animal for speed, suffered greatly in deep snow and required specialized care in freezing temperatures. Their hooves needed regular clearing of compacted snow, and their legs often received protective wrappings. Muleteers and carters carried special equipment for winter journeys: small hammers to remove ice from horses' hooves, woolen blankets to drape over animals during rest periods, and extra feed to meet the increased caloric demands of cold weather travel. Particularly valuable horses might be equipped with leather or fabric booties to protect their legs from cutting ice and packed snow. Oxen, though slower than horses, proved more resilient in harsh conditions and required less specialized feed. Their greater endurance made them the preferred choice for longer winter journeys across remote terrain. A monastery account from northern England notes that the oxen returned from their winter journey to York thin but alive, while 2 horses perished in the same conditions. The loss of transport animals during winter journeys represented such a significant risk that merchant accounts frequently included specific insurance arrangements for this contingency. Against expectations, certain forms of trade not only continued but intensified during winter months. When swamps and wetlands froze solid, previously inaccessible forest regions suddenly opened to human penetration. This allowed the extraction of resources like fur, honey, and timber from remote areas only reachable during frozen conditions. Lithuanian and Russian chronicles describe winter expeditions into dense forests that remained impenetrable during warmer seasons, with sledges carrying out valuable furs and amber along frozen waterways that served as temporary roads. Winter markets and fairs formed a distinctive feature of the medieval commercial calendar, strategically timed to coincide with frozen conditions. The famous winter fair at Novgorod brought together traders from the Hanseatic League, Russia, and even distant Byzantine territories, all taking advantage of frozen rivers to move their goods to this lucrative trading hub. An account from 1215 describes merchants from 16 lands gathered on the ice, their tents and stalls forming a colourful village atop the frozen river, while sledges continued arriving with goods from distant forests. Alpine passes, treacherous even in summer, adopted specialised winter transportation systems. Mountain communities maintained corps of guides who knew the safest winter crossing routes and could lead merchants through high mountain passes. These guides used long poles to probe snow for hidden crevasses and marked safe paths with tall wooden stakes that would remain visible even after fresh snowfall. Travellers crossing the St. Bernard Pass might find shelter in hospices established specifically to prevent deaths among winter travellers. Records from these mountain hostels document thousands of merchants, pilgrims and messengers rescued during winter storms. The nature of goods transported during winter reflected both practical necessity and seasonal opportunity. Perishable foods could travel farther without spoilage in cold conditions. A 14th century German merchant's letter mentions shipping fresh fish packed in snow from Baltic ports to inland cities, reaching markets that would have been impossible during warmer months. Other winter-specific commodities included furs, which were prime during the coldest months when animals' coats were thickest, and certain forest products only harvested during winter dormancy. Communication networks showed remarkable resilience despite winter conditions. Royal and ecclesiastical authorities maintained winter messenger services, with riders following established routes between shelters spaced at appropriate intervals. The speed of information transmission slowed dramatically, but its continued flow remained vital for governance. A remarkable entry in the expense records of Henry III of England notes payment to a messenger who delivered urgent diplomatic correspondence during the severe winter of 1254, having lost 2 toes to frost but delivered his message without delay. For ordinary medieval people, winter's transformation of transportation networks shaped both economic opportunities and isolation. Villages along major frozen rivers might suddenly find themselves on busy transport routes, creating temporary commercial booms. Conversely, communities in mountainous or heavily forested regions could be completely cut off for months. This seasonal rhythm of connection and isolation formed a fundamental aspect of medieval winter life, as communities prepared not just for physical cold, but for the economic and social consequences of altered transportation networks that each winter inevitably brought. As the clock of medieval history ticked past the year 1000, a quiet revolution in winter survival was gaining momentum across Europe. The high medieval period brought with it not merely political changes and population growth, but a suite of technological innovations that transformed how people endured the coldest months. These improvements, emerging gradually and spreading unevenly across regions, collectively represented one of history's most significant advances in human comfort during winter. Perhaps the most transformative innovation was the development of the proper chimney. Earlier medieval dwellings had relied primarily on central hearths, with smoke holes in the roof effective for basic heating, but tremendously inefficient. Smoke filled upper portions of the room before eventually finding its way outside, creating an environment that was sooty, eye-watering, and unhealthy. Around the 11th century, builders began experimenting with more sophisticated methods of smoke removal, initially with simple wall openings above fireplaces. By the 12th century, true chimneys' narrow vertical channels within walls that created draught to draw smoke upward began appearing in castle keeps and manorial halls. The significance of this seemingly simple innovation cannot be overstated. Proper chimneys dramatically improved indoor air quality during winter months, when people spent most of their time enclosed in smoky spaces. The improved draught also allowed fires to burn hotter and more efficiently, extracting more heat from precious winter fuel supplies. Perhaps most importantly, chimneys made possible the movement of fireplaces from central positions to exterior walls, allowing for multiple heating sources within larger structures. A nobleman's hall that once relied on a single central hearth might by 1200 feature several wall fireplaces, creating more evenly distributed warmth throughout the space. The chimney's spread followed the typical pattern of medieval technological diffusion, appearing first in elite spaces, then gradually moving down the social hierarchy. By 1300, many urban townhouses boasted chimney-equipped fireplaces, though rural cottages would lag behind, with many still using central hearths for generations to come. Regional variations developed as well, with elaborate decorative chimney stacks becoming status symbols in some areas, while practical multi-flue designs allowing a single chimney to serve several rooms gained popularity in others. Window technology saw similarly significant advancements during these centuries. Early medieval windows had generally been small openings, either left open to the elements or covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or animal membrane. These coverings offered an unsatisfactory compromise. When closed, they blocked light along with cold air, and when open they admitted daylight but also winter's chill. By the 12th century, wealthier households began installing oiled parchment or linen in window frames, materials that blocked wind while allowing diffuse light to enter. More remarkable was the gradual re-emergence of glass as a practical window material. Though Romans had used glass in windows of elite buildings, this technology had largely disappeared in post-Roman Western Europe. Beginning in the 11th century, small pieces of glass set in lead frames began appearing in church windows. Initially rare and extraordinarily expensive, window glass remained beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest households throughout most of the high medieval period. Even royal residences might feature glass only in the most important chambers, with secondary rooms still relying on shutters or oiled coverings. The glass itself was thick, often tinted green or amber due to mineral impurities, and full of bubbles and striations that distorted views. Yet these imperfect panes transformed winter living by allowing rooms to be simultaneously bright and relatively draught-free. By 1300, specialized glaziers were established in most major European cities, and window glass, while still a luxury, had become more common in urban merchant homes and country manors. This development allowed these spaces to capture precious winter sunlight without admitting freezing air, a subtle but profound improvement in winter quality of life. Textile production underwent its own quiet revolution during the high medieval period, with significant implications for winter survival. The horizontal loom, which increased the speed and efficiency of weaving, allowed for greater production of woolen cloth, the primary material for winter garments. Mills powered by water and increasingly by the 13th century, by wind-mechanized aspects of cloth finishing, particularly fulling, the process of cleaning and thickening woolen fabric. These technological improvements increased both the quality and quantity of textiles available across social classes. With greater cloth production came more sophisticated layering techniques for winter garments. Though no single breakthrough revolutionized medieval clothing, gradual improvements in tailoring created garments that preserved body heat more effectively. Sleeves became more fitted to reduce heat loss at the wrists. Hoods evolved from simple draped fabrics to carefully shaped head coverings, with face openings that could be drawn tight during harsh weather. Lining garments with additional layers of wool, or for the wealthy with fur, became more common practice, creating essentially the medieval equivalent of insulated clothing. For those who could afford them, gloves evolved from simple mittens to more articulated hand coverings that balanced warmth with dexterity. Particularly innovative were convertible mittens used by some craftsmen and hunters, designed with a separate thumb and a flap that could cover or expose the fingers as needed, while working outdoors in cold conditions. Though available only to a minority, such specialized winter gear represented significant quality of life improvements for those who spent long hours outdoors in winter weather. Metallurgical advances during this period yielded improved tools for winter tasks. The gradual spread of water-powered trip hammers and better furnace designs allowed for more efficient iron production and working. This made iron tools vital for winter activities like breaking through ice, clearing snow and chopping frozen ground more readily available to ordinary households. The increased availability of iron nails allowed for sturdier construction of everything from houses to sledges, improving winter durability. Specialized winter tools emerged or became more common, including ice axes for breaking frozen water surfaces and more sophisticated ice skates, now often with iron blades attached to wooden platforms rather than fashioned from animal bone. For travelers, horseshoe design improved significantly, with better fitting methods and sometimes removable winter variations featuring sharp projections for improved traction on icy surfaces. These technological developments, though individually modest, collectively reduced the dangers of winter travel and work, particularly important during a period when commercial activity increasingly continued through winter months rather than halting entirely as in earlier eras. These technological advances interacted with and reinforced each other. Better heated homes with improved lighting from windows allowed for extended periods of winter textile production. Improved textiles kept outdoor workers warmer, allowing them to build better structures. Better metalworking created tools that facilitated all other improvements. Each incremental advance built upon others, gradually transforming winter from a season of mere survival to one in which people could maintain more normal activities despite the cold. While technological progress was never uniform, innovations appearing first in wealthy urban centers might take generations to reach remote rural areas. The cumulative effect by 1300 was a medieval society significantly better equipped to face winter's challenges than their early medieval predecessors had been 3 centuries earlier. These practical innovations, though less dramatic than castle construction or cathedral building, perhaps did more to improve daily life during winter months than any other developments of the high medieval period. As our journey through medieval winters continues, we come to a remarkable period that transformed life across much of Europe for nearly 3 centuries. While we often imagine the medieval era as uniformly harsh and cold, historical evidence reveals a surprising truth: a prolonged warming trend that medieval people experienced as a climatic gift, a time when winters softened their grip and growing seasons extended their reach. This period, which climate historians call the medieval climate optimum, flourished from approximately 950 to 1250 CE, reshaping agriculture, settlement patterns, and daily winter survival across the continent. The warming began gradually in the mid-10th century, with temperatures rising perhaps 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above the averages of previous centuries. This seemingly modest change yielded profound effects. In regions like England, Scandinavia, and northern Germany, winter frost periods shortened by 2 to 3 weeks at each end of the season. Spring thaws arrived earlier, and autumn freezes came later, extending the growing season by up to a month in some years. For communities perpetually balancing on the knife edge between sufficiency and starvation, these additional frost-free weeks meant the difference between hunger and relative abundance. Evidence for this warm period comes from multiple sources. Ice cores drilled from Greenland's ancient glaciers show distinct layers with chemical signatures indicating warmer temperatures. Tree ring studies across Europe reveal wider growth patterns during these centuries, as trees enjoyed longer growing seasons and more favourable conditions. Historical records mention crops growing in places previously too cold to support them. Vineyards flourished in England as far north as York, some 300 miles beyond their current viable range. Norwegian farmers cultivated fields at elevations and latitudes that would lie fallow in later, colder centuries. Perhaps most dramatically, Norse settlers established colonies in Greenland during this period, creating farms and communities in areas that became uninhabitable during the subsequent cooling. The settlers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, growing enough hay during the extended summer seasons to sustain their animals through winters that, while still harsh by Mediterranean standards, were mild enough to allow year-round settlement. Archaeological excavations of these farms have uncovered the bones of cattle alongside traditional northern animals like seals and reindeer, painting a picture of a mixed economy only possible during this unique climatic window. For common people across medieval Europe, the warmer climate manifested most immediately through winter's changing character. January and February remained the coldest months, but their bitter extremes moderated. Deep freezes that might once have lasted weeks now often broke after days. Snow still fell across northern regions, but thaws came more frequently, preventing the accumulation of crushing depths on rooftops or the formation of impassable drifts along travel routes. Rivers and lakes still froze, but for shorter periods, allowing water transportation to resume earlier in spring and continue later into autumn. Winter food storage needs also evolved during this period. The shortened winters meant food stores needed to last through fewer weeks of scarcity. The agricultural bounty from extended growing seasons meant those stores started fuller in the first place. Communities that had once barely survived until spring now occasionally found themselves with surplus grain by February or March. This relative abundance allowed population growth and supported the expansion of towns and cities. It also permitted greater specialization in crafts and trades, as fewer people needed to focus exclusively on food production. The warming climate also transformed settlement patterns, particularly in mountainous regions. Throughout the Alps, Pyrenees, and other European mountain ranges, villages appeared at elevations previously considered too cold for year-round habitation. Pollen samples from high mountain lakes show increased agricultural activity, as farmers planted crops on sunny slopes hundreds of meters higher than had been possible before. These high settlements remained vulnerable to harsh winters, mountain weather being notoriously fickle even in warm periods, but the general moderation of winter conditions made such vulnerability manageable rather than deadly. Not all regions benefited equally from this climate shift. While northern Europe enjoyed milder winters and extended growing seasons, parts of the Mediterranean experienced increased drought as rainfall patterns shifted northward. For most Europeans, however, the medieval climate optimum represented a period of relative environmental benevolence, when winter, though still a formidable presence requiring careful preparation, loosened its grip enough to allow greater prosperity and security. The climatic good fortune extended to marine environments as well. The North Atlantic remained largely free of the extensive sea ice that would characterize later centuries. This allowed more reliable shipping routes between Scandinavia, Iceland, and the new Greenland settlements. Cod fisheries thrived in northern waters, providing abundant protein sources that could be dried and preserved for winter consumption. Historical records from port cities show increased maritime trade during winter months that would become impassable in later colder centuries. While we may envy this period of climatic grace, we should not romanticize medieval life even during these warmer centuries. Winter remained a dangerous season requiring extensive preparation. The elderly and infirm still faced greater mortality during the coldest months. Respiratory diseases still spread through smoky, crowded winter quarters. The warming was also inconsistent interspersed with occasional harsh winters that arrived with little warning, devastating communities that had grown complacent during milder years. By the early 13th century, subtle signs of change began to appear. Glaciers in Norway and the Alps, which had retreated during the warmest period, began slowly advancing again. Tree ring data shows narrowing growth patterns. Historical records mention increasing frequency of crop failures in marginal northern fields that had been productive for generations. The medieval climate optimum was giving way to what we now call the Little Ice Age, a cooler period, that would bring profound challenges to European populations that had expanded during the centuries of warmth. The transition occurred gradually, with temperatures declining over decades rather than years. Many communities adapted unconsciously at first, slightly altering planting patterns or winter preparation timelines without recognizing they were responding to a fundamental shift in climate patterns. By 1300, however, the cooling trend had become unmistakable. The relative grace period was ending, and medieval populations would soon face winter challenges more severe than anything their grandparents or great-grandparents had known. The medieval climate optimum represents a fascinating window into how climate shapes human fortunes, how a mere degree or two of temperature change can transform food security, settlement patterns, and the fundamental rhythms of human life. For the generations fortunate enough to live during this warm interval, winter's annual siege became slightly less threatening, slightly more manageable. They could not know their descendants would look back on this period as a climatic golden age, a time when nature briefly relaxed its harshest constraints before tightening its grip once more. While the rural peasantry faced winter with the bare protection of humble cottages and stored harvests, medieval towns and cities confronted the cold season with their own unique set of challenges. Urban centres, with their concentrated populations and complex social hierarchies, experienced winter as a communal trial that tested both physical infrastructure and social fabric. The narrow streets and crowded buildings that defined medieval urban landscapes shaped a winter experience distinctly different from that of the countryside. The physical layout of medieval cities intensified winter's effects. Streets, rarely more than a few paces wide, became shadowed canyons where sunlight seldom penetrated during winter's short days. Buildings constructed with jutting upper stories, each floor extending farther over the street than the one below, further blocked precious sunlight. In cities like London, York, or Paris, many ground-floor dwellings and shops might go weeks without direct sunlight touching their thresholds. This perpetual shadow deepened winter's psychological burden, while also creating practical hazards as compacted snow turned to treacherous ice that could persist for weeks in these sun-starved passages. Winter sanitation presented perhaps the most pressing urban challenge. The drainage systems of even the most sophisticated medieval cities relied on open gutters running down the centres of streets, carrying away household waste and rainwater. Winter frost regularly froze these channels solid, trapping waste in gradually accumulating frozen layers. A sudden thaw might release weeks of accumulated refuse in foul floods that invaded ground-floor dwellings. Municipal records from 14th century Norwich describe great stinking after midwinter thaws when all manner of filth locked in ice did suddenly flow through the lower town. The great stink of medieval winters posed more than mere discomfort, it brought serious health risks. While medieval people lacked understanding of bacterial contamination, they recognized through experience that winter thaws often preceded outbreaks of illness. Civic authorities in larger cities attempted to address these challenges through ordinances requiring residents to clear ice and waste from the streets before their dwellings. Records from 15th century Nuremberg detail fines imposed on households that failed to break and clear the ice from the common way. After snowfall, while London records mention appointment of scavengers responsible for clearing major thoroughfares. Water supply, essential for daily urban life, demanded constant attention during freezing weather. Public fountains and wells, The primary water sources for most urban dwellers required protection from freezing. Larger cities employed specialized workers to break ice from public water sources each morning. In particularly harsh winters, designated fire tenders maintained small fires near fountains to prevent complete freezing. Wealthier households might send servants to collect water before dawn when the ice was thinnest, creating a daily pre-dawn ritual of bucket-carrying figures navigating dark, frozen streets by lantern light. Fire posed a paradoxical winter threat, both essential for survival, yet potentially catastrophic. The increased use of hearth fires during cold months inevitably led to more accidents. The timber-framed, thatch-roofed buildings of most medieval cities burned with terrifying speed, and winter conditions complicated firefighting efforts. Frozen water sources and snow-blocked streets hindered bucket brigades, while bitter cold made evacuation more dangerous for those suddenly rendered homeless. The Great London Fire of February 1212, which claimed perhaps 1,000 lives when a southerly bridge entrance became blocked during evacuation, exemplifies the heightened vulnerability urban populations faced when winter and fire combined forces. Fuel supply dominated urban winter concerns. Unlike rural dwellers who might gather firewood throughout the year from nearby woodlands, city residents relied on commercial fuel supplies, transported from increasingly distant sources as centuries of urban consumption depleted nearby forests. By the 13th century, major cities like Paris and London had developed sophisticated fuel markets with regulated prices, standardized measures, and specialized merchants. The woodmongers and coal merchants of medieval London operated under strict guild regulations concerning quality, measure, and price, particularly during winter months when demand peaked. For the urban poor, winter fuel costs could consume a crippling portion of limited income. Records from 15th century York suggest poorer households might spend up to 1/3 of their winter earnings simply on staying warm. Those unable to afford sufficient fuel developed creative adaptations. Shared warming spaces became common in poorer neighbourhoods, where several families might maintain a single fire, taking turns supplying fuel and sharing its heat. The poorest might spend daylight hours in churches, which were often the best heated public spaces in medieval cities, lingering at prayer while absorbing the relative warmth before returning to unheated dwellings. Winter transformed urban economies, creating seasonal patterns of work and commerce. Construction projects largely halted, leaving builders, stonemasons, and their labourers without income. Meanwhile, demand surged for specialised winter workers, icebreakers who cleared frozen rivers, snow clearers who opened important thoroughfares, and the fuel merchants mentioned earlier. Taverns and alehouses did brisk business as these warmed gathering places became even more attractive during cold months. Specialized winter markets appeared in many cities, selling woolen garments, candles, preserved foods, and fuel. Municipal authorities gradually developed systematic responses to winter's challenges. By the later medieval period, many larger cities maintained emergency grain stores to moderate price increases when winter weather interrupted supply routes. Guild-based charity systems provided fuel allowances to widows and orphans of former members. Some cities established winter shelters for the homeless and travellers, often attached to monasteries or hospitals. The City Council of 15th century Brussels maintained a special winter fund used to purchase fuel for distribution among the poor when frost exceeds 7 days and threatens the lives of the Christ poor. Social stratification became starkly visible during urban winters. Wealthy merchants and nobles insulated themselves from winter's worst effects through well-constructed homes with multiple hearths, stores of quality fuel, and servants to manage winter tasks. The urban middle classes, skilled artisans and shopkeepers, typically maintained at least one hearth, but carefully rationed fuel to balance comfort against cost. The working poor might have access only to small braziers that provided minimum warmth at lower fuel cost, while the destitute might experience winter as a season of continuous, life-threatening cold, mitigated only by public charity and shared warming spaces. As darkness fell early on winter evenings, the social rhythm of urban life adjusted to the season. Workdays shortened with available light, but evening activities flourished. Guilds scheduled meetings during winter evenings when workshop production naturally decreased. Religious services adopted winter schedules with additional evening devotions. The wealthy hosted indoor entertainments ranging from elaborate feasts to intimate gatherings for music, games, and conversation creating social warmth against the cold beyond their well-insulated walls. While peasants huddled in humble cottages and townsfolk crowded into narrow urban dwellings, the medieval nobility experienced winter from behind massive stone walls. Castles, those iconic symbols of medieval power, were not merely military fortifications, but also sophisticated responses to winter's challenges. Their very structure, from foundation to battlement, reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving the coldest months in relative comfort. The defining feature of castle construction, thick stone walls served a dual purpose that became particularly valuable during winter. While primarily built for defense against human adversaries, these massive barriers, often exceeding 10 feet in thickness, provided remarkable insulation against winter's assault. Stone, though initially cold to the touch, possesses excellent thermal mass, absorbing heat slowly during the day and releasing it gradually through the night. This property created more stable interior temperatures than could be achieved in wooden structures, preventing the rapid fluctuations that made winter particularly dangerous and uncomfortable. Within these protective shells, the Great Hall served as the castle's winter heart. Here, beneath high, timber-framed ceilings, the lord and his household gathered around fires that burned day and night through the coldest months. Early medieval halls featured central hearths, with smoke finding its way out through louvers in the roof. This arrangement, while smoky, distributed heat effectively throughout the space. By the 12th century, the development of proper chimney technology transformed winter comfort in elite spaces. Wall fireplaces, often massive enough to roast an ox, drew smoke efficiently upward while radiating heat into the room. The most sophisticated castles incorporated multiple fireplaces throughout their chambers, allowing for heated private spaces beyond the communal hall. Archaeological evidence from 14th century castles shows that noble bedchambers, solars, family rooms, and even some passageways had their own heat sources. At Bodiam Castle in Sussex, built in the 1380s, nearly every major room featured its own fireplace, a luxury that transformed winter living for the elite. Castle accounts reveal the enormous fuel consumption these arrangements required. The royal castle at Winchester recorded using over 1,600 cartloads of firewood during the winter of 1409-1410, representing a staggering investment of resources accessible only to the wealthiest levels of society. Window design reflected careful consideration of the competing needs for light, security, and heat retention. Early castles featured narrow arrow slits that limited heat loss, but provided minimal illumination. As defensive needs became less pressing in the later medieval period, windows grew larger but incorporated features to manage winter's chill. Wooden shutters could be closed over window openings during the harshest weather or at night. The most luxurious chambers featured horn panes or oiled parchment coverings that admitted some light while blocking drafts. By the 14th century, the wealthiest nobles installed costly glass in their primary residences, creating spaces that remained relatively bright even when sealed against winter storms. Water management presented particular challenges during freezing weather. Castle builders demonstrated remarkable foresight by incorporating features to maintain water access through winter. Many castles included wells within their walls, reaching deep enough to access groundwater that remained liquid even during freezes. Cisterns collected and stored rainwater within thick-walled chambers where it was less likely to freeze. Some sophisticated castle designs included kitchen areas positioned to allow their heat to protect nearby water sources. At Leeds Castle in Kent, a stream was channeled directly beneath the structure, where it would benefit from the building's warmth and remain flowing throughout winter. Food storage facilities within castle complexes reflected careful planning for winter isolation. Deep cellars maintained relatively stable temperatures, protecting stores from freezing. Castle pantries held preserved meats, dried fruits, grains, and nuts in quantities calculated to sustain the household through even the longest winters. Castle accounts reveal that storing sufficient winter provisions required careful management. The steward of Framlingham Castle in Suffolk documented a winter preparation inventory from 1385 that included 28 cattle carcasses salted for preservation, 60 barrels of salted fish, 500 dried stockfish, and grain sufficient to provide bread for over 80 household members for 6 months. Daily life patterns within castles shifted distinctively during winter months. The household's activities contracted inward, with outer baileys and courtyards seeing minimal use during the harshest weather. Movement concentrated along protected walkways and through covered passages. Daily routines shifted to maximize available daylight, with meals served earlier in the afternoon before darkness fell. Castle staff developed winter-specific tasks. Rushes on floors would be changed less frequently, but supplemented with fragrant herbs to combat the stuffiness of closed rooms. Tapestries, which hung on walls year-round for decoration, took on additional importance as insulation against cold emanating from stone walls. Regional adaptations across Europe reflected local winter conditions. Northern castles in Scandinavia and Scotland featured fewer, smaller windows and more compact layouts to minimize heat loss. Mountain castles in alpine regions incorporated steeper roof pitches to shed heavy snow loads. Mediterranean castles, designed primarily for summer cooling, often struggled during brief but bitter winter cold snaps, leading to the addition of warming features in otherwise heat-shedding designs. German and Central European castles often featured massive tile stoves, Kachelöfen, that radiated gentle heat for hours after a relatively brief firing, offering greater fuel efficiency than open hearths. By the late medieval period, comfort increasingly rivaled defence in castle design considerations. Kenilworth Castle's improvements under John of Gaunt in the 1370s included not just military upgrades but luxurious private apartments with multiple fireplaces, glazed windows, and a sophisticated plumbing system protected from freezing. Such winter-ready accommodations allowed the aristocracy to maintain their expected lifestyle despite the season's challenges. While the peasantry might substantially alter their activities during winter, the nobility could continue to feast, entertain, conduct business, and maintain court life behind walls that increasingly kept winter at bay, at least for those with sufficient wealth and status to command the necessary resources. The castle thus stood as winter's most formidable architectural adversary, embodying medieval engineering's most sophisticated response to seasonal challenges. Yet even these massive structures remained vulnerable to winter's worst extremes. Castle chronicles record frozen wells, collapsed roofs under snow weight, and winters so bitter that wine froze in barrels and ink in scribes' rooms. Such events remind us that despite stone barriers and blazing hearths, medieval winter retained its power to humble even the mightiest works of human hands. As medieval winters descended with their bitter cold, survival depended not just on sheltering within stone walls or beside crackling fires, but on the layers that separated vulnerable human flesh from the freezing air. The evolution of winter clothing through the medieval millennium represents one of humanity's most practical yet overlooked technological developments, an intimate armour against nature's most threatening season. In the early medieval period, winter garments retained much of their pre-medieval simplicity. The fundamental layer for all classes was the linen undertunic, worn next to the skin. Though linen itself provided minimal insulation, it served a crucial function by wicking moisture away from the body. In an age before waterproof fabrics, keeping dry formed the first defence against deadly winter chill. Atop this base layer, woolen tunics and overtunics created the primary insulating layers, their thickness and number increasing with the severity of the climate. Wool dominated medieval winter wardrobes for practical reasons that transcended fashion or class. Its natural crimp trapped countless tiny air pockets that provided remarkable insulation even when the weight remained manageable. Perhaps most crucially, wool retained most of its insulating properties even when damp a life-saving quality in northern Europe's wet winter conditions. The humble sheep thus became the medieval person's most reliable ally against winter's assault. The processing of wool itself followed winter's rhythms. Summer shearing yielded the raw material that women would clean, card, spin, and weave during the dark winter months when agricultural work diminished. The characteristic whir of the spinning wheel and the rhythmic clack of the loom provided the soundtrack to countless winter evenings as families transformed summer's harvest into protection against the very season in which they worked. Technological advances in textile production gradually transformed winter clothing throughout the medieval period. The introduction of the horizontal loom in the 11th century, followed by the more efficient treadle loom, allowed for faster production of higher quality fabrics. By the 13th century, fulling mills powered by water and later wind mechanized the process of cleaning and thickening woolen cloth, creating denser, more weatherproof materials. These developments meant that winter garments became increasingly specialized and effective, particularly for those who could afford the better grades of cloth. The cut of winter clothing evolved similarly. Early medieval garments tended towards simple designs, essentially rectangular pieces joined with minimal tailoring. By the high medieval period, garments had become more fitted, with set-in sleeves that reduced drafts at the shoulder and armholes that didn't allow cold air to circulate freely around the body. The development of buttons in the 13th century further improved winter clothing, allowing for tighter closures than previous lacing or pin systems had permitted. Wealthy nobles benefited from additional winter protections unavailable to common folk. Fur represented the ultimate winter luxury, with different types signifying precise gradations of status. Ermine, sable, and miniver, the belly fur of the red squirrel, adorned the winter garments of kings and high nobility, while more common furs like rabbit, fox, and sheep lined the garments of the lesser elite. Most furs were worn with the fur facing inward against the body for maximum warmth, with only decorative strips or edgings visible on the garment's exterior. For peasants and urban labourers, whose winter clothing needed to accommodate strenuous outdoor work, layering provided the primary defence against cold. A typical winter outfit might include linen undergarments, 1 or 2 woolen tunics of increasing thickness, a hood or hat, woolen hose or leg wrappings, mittens or gloves, and perhaps a cloak for the fortunate. Those working outdoors often wrapped their feet in rags before placing them in leather shoes or boots, a crude but effective system that trapped warm air around the vulnerable extremities. Regional variations in winter clothing reflected both local materials and climate conditions. In Scandinavia, clothing incorporated greater quantities of fur, even among common folk, and specialised items like the mittens discovered in Norse settlements were designed with separate thumbs, but a single space for all fingers, maximising warmth by allowing fingers to share heat. Alpine communities developed layered wool systems that emphasised versatility, allowing workers to adjust their insulation as exertion heated the body despite frigid air temperatures. Mediterranean regions, with their milder winters, relied more on additional layers of the same garments worn in autumn, rather than specialised winter clothing. Children's winter clothing generally mimicked adult styles in miniature, though evidence suggests that even in relatively modest households, particular attention was paid to keeping the youngest members warm. Swaddling infants with multiple layers remained standard practice, and children's garments often incorporated extra layers around the chest and back. Nevertheless, winter claimed a disproportionate number of the very young, whose smaller bodies lost heat more rapidly than those of adults. One of the most significant developments in medieval winter clothing was the specialised headwear that evolved to protect this heat-losing extremity. Early medieval hoods were typically attached to short capes that covered the shoulders and upper chest. By the High Middle Ages, these had evolved into separate, more adaptable garments that could be pulled forward to shield the face from bitter winds or folded back when conditions allowed. Separate hats became increasingly common, with some designed specifically for winter use with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Handwear followed a similar evolutionary path. Early mittens, essentially bags with thumbs, gradually gave way to more sophisticated designs, including leather versions lined with wool or fur for those who could afford them. True gloves with separate fingers, though less efficient for retaining heat, became popular among the nobility who valued dexterity alongside warmth, particularly for activities like winter hunting. Footwear presented the greatest winter challenge, as feet remained vulnerable to both cold and dangerous moisture. Leather boots, the standard footwear for those who could afford them, provided some protection, but required regular maintenance with tallow or oils to maintain water resistance. The poorest sometimes resorted to wooden pattens overshoes with raised wooden platforms to navigate through snow and slush, while keeping leather shoes relatively dry. In the most extreme northern regions, boots of felted wool provided superior insulation, particularly when lined with straw or hay that could be replaced when damp. By the late medieval period, winter clothing had reached a level of sophistication that would remain relatively unchanged until the Industrial Revolution. The gradual accumulation of textile technologies, tailoring techniques and practical experience had created winter garments that, while still inadequate by modern standards, represented the best protection against cold that human ingenuity could devise with pre-industrial technology. These developments, the shaped hood, the button closure, the layered system, the waterproofed boot, may seem unremarkable from our perspective of synthetic fabrics and central heating. Yet they saved countless lives during the 1,000 winters of medieval Europe. After nearly 3 centuries of relative warmth and agricultural prosperity, a subtle but profound shift began altering the climate of medieval Europe. The first hints of change appeared in the late 13th century, as Icelandic harbours that had remained ice-free through previous winters began experiencing regular freezing. In Alpine villages, glaciers that had retreated up mountainsides for generations suddenly halted their withdrawal and silently began their advanced downslope once more. Farmers in northern regions noticed their growing seasons gradually shortening, with spring frosts lingering later and autumn chills arriving earlier than their grandparents had recorded. These scattered observations, noted in monastic chronicles, tax records, and village memory, represented the first whispers of what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of general cooling that would transform European climate and challenge medieval civilization for over 5 centuries. The shift occurred so gradually that few contemporaries recognized they were living through a significant climatic transition. A colder winter, a wetter summer, a late spring frost, each might be dismissed as the natural variation of weather. Yet by the early 14th century, the cumulative pattern had become unmistakable. Tree ring studies from this period reveal the biological signature of this cooling narrower growth rings, indicating shorter, less favourable growing conditions. In the vineyards of England, where grapes had flourished during the medieval climate optimum, harvests became increasingly unpredictable. By 1300, many northern English vineyards had been abandoned entirely, their owners converting fields to hardier grains or pasture. Similar retreats of temperature-sensitive crops occurred across northern Europe, as the warming that had allowed agricultural expansion into marginal lands reversed itself. Unlike modern climate change, the cooling did not progress uniformly across years or regions. Rather, it manifested as increased volatility, greater extremes of both cold and precipitation, with devastating effects on medieval agriculture. The years 1315-1317 brought the most severe crisis, a period known as the Great Famine. Unusually heavy spring and summer rains saturated fields across northwestern Europe, rotting seeds before they could germinate and preventing proper ripening of what crops did grow. Desperate farmers watched helplessly as their carefully tended fields became sodden, weed-choked expanses yielding a fraction of normal harvests. The Anglo-Norman chronicler Jean de Troquelot described the situation in stark terms. The people ate dogs and horses and cats. Some stole children and ate them, and others broke into the houses of the dead and ate them too. While such accounts likely contain elements of exaggeration, archaeological evidence from this period confirms significant nutritional stress in the population. Skeletal remains show growth interruptions and evidence of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Tax records and manor accounts document grain prices rising to 5 or 6 times their normal levels, putting basic sustenance beyond the reach of many. The meteorological trigger for this particular crisis, excess rain, rather than cold, demonstrates the complex nature of climatic deterioration. The Little Ice Age brought not simply colder temperatures but disrupted weather patterns. Changes in atmospheric circulation created prolonged blocking patterns where storms stalled over particular regions for weeks. Winter storms grew more frequent and severe. Summer rainfall patterns shifted, sometimes bringing drought, sometimes excessive precipitation. As these patterns persisted beyond living memory of better times, medieval communities were forced to develop adaptive strategies. In alpine regions, where advancing glaciers threatened to overwhelm mountain villages, entire communities sometimes relocated to lower elevations. The village of Chamonix in the French Alps recorded moving several kilometers down valley after a glacier advance destroyed pastures that had been utilized for centuries. In Iceland, farming practices shifted dramatically. Fields once used for grain cultivation were converted to hay production for livestock, as cereal agriculture became increasingly risky. Food storage systems evolved to address the greater uncertainty of harvests. Many communities constructed additional granaries and developed more sophisticated preservation techniques. The practice of communal grain reserves, administered by local authorities or monasteries specifically to sustain the population through lean years, expanded across Europe. These institutions functioned as primitive insurance systems against the increased climatically driven volatility in food production. Architectural adaptations reflect the cooling climate as well. Houses built in the 14th and 15th centuries featured smaller windows than earlier structures, sacrificing light to reduce heat loss. Chimneys and fireplaces became more sophisticated, with designs focused on maximizing heat while minimizing smoke. In regions where wood was scarce, homes were increasingly clustered together, sharing walls to conserve heat. The typical peasant dwelling evolved to include more substantial insulation, thicker thatch, sealed walls, and in some areas, banked earth against the foundation for additional thermal protection. Clothing underwent similar evolution. Paintings and manuscript illustrations from the early Little Ice Age period show people wearing multiple layers, heavier fabrics, and more complete coverage than in earlier centuries. Wool production intensified across Europe, with sheep breed selected for finer, warmer fleece. Archaeological textile fragments reveal increasingly sophisticated weaving techniques that created warmer fabrics from the same materials. Knitting, which creates naturally elastic and insulating garments, spread widely during this period, with the first knitting guilds established in Paris by the early 14th century. The psychological impact of this climatic deterioration manifests in cultural and artistic expressions. Religious processions and prayers specifically addressing unseasonable weather became more common. Saints associated with weather sent. Medard for rain, St. Barbara for storms, St. Urban for frost received increased veneration. Art from the period increasingly depicts winter scenes with a stark realism absent in earlier medieval representations. Peter Bruegel, the Elder's Winter Landscapes, though painted in the later stages of the Little Ice Age, capture the cultural memory of this adaptation showing communities that had learned to function despite the ice and snow, with children playing on frozen ponds while adults continue necessary work. Weather events once considered exceptional gradually became incorporated into the expected rhythm of life. Calendar systems and agricultural planning adapted to accommodate the increased frequency of late frosts and early autumn storms. Seed varieties shifted toward those with shorter growing seasons and greater cold tolerance, though with typically lower yields. The agricultural calendar itself was adjusted, with spring planting delayed and harvesting often begun earlier regardless of full ripening, as security from early frosts took precedence over maximum yield. Perhaps most significantly, social systems evolved to address the increased vulnerability. Medieval communities had always maintained mechanisms to support their weakest members during winter's scarcity, but these systems became more formalized and extensive during the early Little Ice Age. Guild support for widows and orphans expanded, monastery almsgiving became more systematic. Village customs increasingly included specific provisions for redistributing resources during climate-induced hardships. As the 14th century progressed, these adaptations gradually became the new normal. Medieval Europe had begun its long adjustment to a colder, less predictable climate that would persist until the 19th century. The medieval capacity for adaptation would be severely tested, particularly when this climatic challenge combined with other crises. The coming decades would reveal whether the social fabric woven during the relatively benign medieval climate optimum could withstand the harsher conditions of a cooling world. As winter's grip tightened across the continent, medieval civilization faced perhaps its greatest test of resilience. The cooling climate that heralded the Little Ice Age brought more than just agricultural challenges to medieval communities. It arrived in tragic synchronicity with humanity's most devastating biological crisis, the plague that would later be called the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this catastrophic disease swept across Europe, claiming perhaps 1/3 of the population in its initial wave, with subsequent outbreaks continuing for centuries. The relationship between winter and plague created complex patterns that shaped both the spread of disease and society's response to it. The disease's primary vectors, fleas carried by rats, became less active during colder months, slowing transmission in northern regions. Contemporary accounts note how outbreaks often diminished with the first hard frosts of winter, only to resurge with spring's warming temperatures. A Florentine chronicler observed in 1348 that, with December's chill came blessed pause in the dying, as if winter's breath had frozen even death's hand, though none dared hope the respite would endure beyond first thaw. This apparent seasonal pattern created a calendar of dread in plague-affected communities. Autumn brought not just the usual winter preparation, but anxious speculation about whether plague would return with the following spring. Yet winter offered an incomplete refuge. While the initial Black Death spread more slowly during winter months, the plague did not disappear entirely. Instead, it transformed. In the coldest months, pneumonic plague spread directly from person to person through coughing rather than through flea bites, often became the dominant form of the disease. This pneumonic variant proved particularly deadly in winter conditions, when people gathered in closed, poorly ventilated spaces to conserve heat, creating ideal conditions for respiratory transmission. The winter manifestation of plague interacted with the season's existing respiratory challenges. Medieval healers had long observed winter's association with lung ailments, what they called winter fever and chest catarrhs. The symptoms of pneumonic plague fever, difficulty breathing, coughing, initially resembled these familiar winter maladies, delaying recognition and isolation of the infected. A 14th century Italian physician lamented that winter's common cough and plague's deadly assault appear as twins at first glance, the former a wolf in familiar clothing, the latter a wolf indeed. Winter conditions complicated the care of the infected. Plague victims suffered intense fevers that left them desperately thirsty, yet winter ice sometimes made water access difficult. The plague's characteristic swellings buboes were particularly painful in cold environments where circulation already struggled in extremities. The ill faced the double threat of disease and freezing, while caregivers worked in desperate conditions. A French account describes plague hospitals where water froze in bowls beside the sick, and those still strong enough shivered more from winter's bite than fever's heat. Medieval quarantine practices evolved with particular attention to winter circumstances. Maritime quarantines requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before landing proved especially harsh during winter storms. Venice, Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik and other Mediterranean ports developed specialized winter quarantine procedures. Inland communities established pest houses on their outskirts, where the infected and exposed were confined. These crude isolation facilities required special winter provisions, extra fuel, insulated construction, and food supplies that could last without spoiling in fluctuating temperatures. The plague's demographic devastation fundamentally altered winter survival strategies across medieval Europe. Labour shortages following major outbreaks meant fewer hands for essential winter preparation tasks. Harvesting and storing food, cutting and stacking firewood, repairing homes against winter weather. Communities that had lost half their population to plague found themselves with abundant resources per survivor, but insufficient labour to properly prepare those resources for winter use. A monastery chronicle from southern Germany notes that, after the great dying, our granaries stood full, yet many went hungry, for the grain lay unharvested in frost-covered fields. Winter's challenges magnified the social reorganisation triggered by the plague. The severe labour shortage following major outbreaks gave surviving workers unprecedented leverage, particularly regarding winter working conditions. Agricultural labourers increasingly refused to perform winter tasks without additional compensation, warmer clothing, guaranteed shelter during storms, extra food rations. English manorial records show a sharp increase in winter work allowances after 1350, with specific provisions for frost days, when outdoor work was suspended but payment continued. The wealthier classes responded with legislation attempting to freeze wages and working conditions at pre-plague levels. England's Statute of Labourers 1351 specifically addressed winter labour, forbidding workers from demanding excessive compensation for work during frost or snow. Similar regulations across Europe attempted to preserve the social order against the economic pressures created by demographic collapse with limited success. Winter became a seasonal battlefield in this struggle, with the nobility's need for winter services giving labourers their strongest negotiating position. Religious interpretations of the plague evolved distinctive seasonal dimensions. Winter, already associated with death and dormancy in Christian symbolism, became linked with divine judgment and potential renewal. Plague processions and prayers, public rituals requesting divine intervention against the disease-adopted elements from earlier winter ceremonies, seeking protection against winter famine and cold. The plague St. Sebastian, traditionally depicted exposed to the elements, became associated with both plague protection and defence against winter's harshness. By 1400, European communities had developed complex seasonal rhythms in response to recurrent plague. Winter preparations included not just food storage and fuel gathering, but plague contingency planning, identifying isolation spaces, establishing emergency burial procedures for frozen ground, and storing herbs thought to purify plague-contaminated air. The proactive communities of the later medieval period approached winter with dual strategies for surviving both cold and contagion, recognizing that either might arrive with little warning. This integration of plague awareness into winter preparation represented a profound shift in medieval consciousness. Winter had always embodied predictable hardship, a season that arrived annually with familiar challenges. The plague introduced a new dimension of unpredictable catastrophe. The plague-winter nexus taught medieval communities that preparation, while essential, offered incomplete protection against an uncertain future, a lesson that would reshape European society for centuries to come. As medieval communities confronted the harsh realities of the Little Ice Age, they gradually refined their food preservation methods into increasingly sophisticated systems. These advanced storage techniques represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations and improved through bitter experience. For the medieval household, properly stored food meant not merely comfort during winter's grip, but survival itself. Root cellaring evolved from simple pits into carefully engineered spaces that maintained remarkably consistent temperatures and humidity levels. These underground chambers, typically excavated beneath homes or outbuildings, took advantage of the Earth's natural insulating properties. The most effective cellars maintained temperatures just above freezing cold enough to prevent spoilage, but not so cold as to damage the stored produce. Careful attention was paid to drainage, as moisture represented the cellar's greatest enemy. Floors sloped slightly toward central channels that directed water away from stored goods, while walls might be lined with straw or wooden planking to minimize condensation. Inside these cellars, different vegetables required specific storage conditions, reflecting a nuanced understanding of food preservation that belies the common perception of medieval simplicity. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips were typically buried in layers of clean sand or sawdust, which regulated moisture while preventing direct contact between individual vegetables that might spread decay. Cabbages might be hung from ceiling joists, their outer leaves left intact to protect the inner heart. Apples and pears required separate storage, as the ethylene gas they naturally emitted accelerated the spoilage of other produce. The most sophisticated households maintained different chambers with varying conditions, cooler sections for roots and tubers, slightly warmer areas for fruits. For urban dwellers lacking access to personal cellars, community storage facilities emerged in many towns by the 14th century. Guilds or municipal authorities maintained shared cold rooms, often built into hillsides or beneath public buildings, where citizens could rent space for their winter provisions. Records from Nuremberg describe a communal winter house, excavated beneath the town hall, with designated areas for different families marked by branded tokens. Meat preservation techniques had advanced considerably from the simple salting methods of earlier centuries. By the late medieval period, a sophisticated understanding of curing had emerged, with different combinations of salt, saltpeter, and spices used for various meats. Pork remained the most commonly preserved meat, but specialized techniques developed for beef, mutton, and game. White brining, using salt and white wine vinegar with herbs, created less heavily salted meat that retained more flavor, though at the cost of a shorter preservation period. This technique became increasingly popular among wealthier households, who could afford to sacrifice storage longevity for improved taste. Smoking methods diversified as well, with specialized smokehouses constructed to optimize results. Different woods were selected for their specific flavoring properties: oak for its robust flavor with beef, apple wood for pork, and juniper for game and fowl. The most advanced smoking chambers featured multiple levels that created temperature gradients, allowing smoke to cool before reaching the meat, resulting in more even preservation and better flavor development. Cold smoking, conducted at temperatures below 85 Bürstürmex, 32 Wen over several weeks, produced more durable products, while hot smoking at higher temperatures created more immediately edible, but less long-lasting preserved meats. Perhaps the most significant advancement came through combining preservation methods. Meats might be partially salted, briefly fermented, then smoked, with each step controlled to produce specific results. This layered approach reduced the intensity of any single preservation method while maintaining food safety, resulting in more palatable winter provisions. Records from monastic kitchens reveal elaborate instructions for such multi-stage preservation, suggesting that religious houses often led innovation in food storage techniques. Grain storage witnessed similar refinements. Beyond the traditional elevated granaries, late medieval communities developed more sophisticated systems for maintaining dry conditions. Heated floors beneath storage areas helped to drive off moisture during damp periods. Specially designed ventilation systems allowed air circulation while preventing rodent entry. Some regions developed the practice of mixing grain with certain herbs believed to repel pests. Mint, artemisia, and elder leaves appear frequently in storage recommendations from the period. For communities near coastlines, winter brought opportunities for fresh protein through seasonal fish migrations. Late medieval fishermen developed increasingly effective techniques for preserving their catch. Beyond traditional drying and salting, they created specialized fermentation methods that transformed fresh fish into stable products like Swedish surströmming or Icelandic hakal. While the resulting strong flavors might repel modern palates, these techniques provided crucial protein during the winter months. The spice trade, expanding dramatically during this period, transformed winter eating for those who could afford its products. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg did more than add flavor. Their antimicrobial properties actually extended the shelf life of preserved foods. Wealthy households incorporated these expensive ingredients into their preservation methods, creating more palatable winter provisions. Court records from 15th century France describe barrels of spiced beef prepared with pepper, cinnamon, and wine that remained edible throughout winter, while retaining flavor that unspiced preserved meat could not match. By the late medieval period, winter provisions in a well-supplied household no longer represented mere survival rations, but a carefully planned supply that maintained reasonable variety and nutrition through the coldest months. The lady of the manor would typically maintain detailed inventory systems, planning consumption rates to ensure supplies lasted until spring. Written household guides from the 15th century recommend regular inventory checks, with special attention to items showing early signs of spoilage, which would be consumed immediately rather than wasted. These advanced food storage techniques represented one of medieval society's most significant adaptations to seasonal scarcity. Through centuries of refinement, communities had developed methods that not only prevented starvation, but maintained a level of nutrition and variety that would have seemed impossible to their early medieval ancestors. The knowledge embedded in these practices when to harvest which crops for maximum storage life, how to recognise the earliest signs of spoilage, which preservation methods suited, which foods represented a sophisticated cultural inheritance passed down through generations of winter survivors. As winter's icy grip tightened across medieval landscapes, no resource became more precious than fuel. The gathering of winter warmth, that patient accumulation of materials that could transform into life-sustaining heat, represented one of the most sophisticated and carefully managed systems of medieval life. While modern eyes might see merely piles of wood or heaps of coal, medieval communities recognized these as the very currency of winter survival, gathered and protected with a care that approached reverence. Woodland management evolved into a complex science long before modern forestry. By the High Middle Ages, most European forests existed not as untamed wilderness, but as carefully tended resources under sophisticated stewardship. The practice of cutting trees near ground level to stimulate multiple new shoots from the stump-created sustainable wood harvests from the same trees generation after generation. Oak, ash, and hazel responded particularly well to this treatment, sprouting straight, uniform poles that could be harvested in carefully planned cycles of 7 to 25 years, depending on the species and desired size. Evidence from manorial records reveals the careful planning involved in woodland stewardship. A well-managed medieval estate divided its woodlands into sections called falls or springs, harvesting one section annually while allowing others to regrow. This rotation ensured perpetual supply without exhausting the resource. Some woodlands maintained complex mixed systems, standard trees allowed to grow to full height, interspersed among coppiced undergrowth, providing both timber for construction and smaller wood for fuel. The gathering of winter fuel began in earnest during late summer and autumn, when agricultural demands lessened. Entire families would work together, cutting, splitting, and stacking wood to dry before winter moisture set in. Even children contributed by gathering windfall branches brought down by storms and bundling smaller sticks into faggots for quick-starting fires. Medieval artwork often depicts this seasonal activity, showing bent figures carrying enormous bundles of sticks on their backs, a visual testament to the human energy invested in winter warmth. The right to gather fuel presented a complex aspect of medieval social structures. Common rights often included estovers, the entitlement to collect dead wood from forests and common lands. However, these rights were carefully circumscribed. Taking live wood or cutting trees usually remained forbidden to commoners. Court records from villages across Europe document numerous cases of fines levied against those who overstepped these boundaries. Taking green wood when only dead branches were permitted, or using wood-cutting tools in forests where only gathering by hand was allowed. By the 13th century, as populations grew and woodlands diminished, alternative fuels gained increasing importance. Peat, the compressed plant matter found in boggy areas, became a crucial resource in woodland-poor regions. The cutting of peat followed its own seasonal rhythms. Spring and early summer saw the careful excavation of peat blocks, which would then dry throughout summer before being stacked in autumn. A skilled peat cutter could slice the dense material into uniform blocks that dried efficiently and stacked stably for transport. In parts of northern Europe, particularly the Netherlands and coastal regions, peat cutting reshaped entire landscapes, creating the patterned wetlands still visible today. Coal, though known since antiquity, saw expanded use during the medieval period, particularly in regions where surface deposits were accessible. By the 13th century, coal mining operations in northeastern England and parts of the Low Countries had developed into substantial enterprises. Unlike wood or peat, coal required specific adaptations for domestic use due to its sulphurous smoke and different burning properties. Special grates and hearth designs emerged in coal-burning regions, demonstrating medieval ingenuity in adapting to available resources. The distribution of winter fuel within communities reflected social hierarchies while acknowledging universal need. Manorial customs often included fuel allowances for the poorest villagers, recognizing that winter cold threatened everyone regardless of status. Church records document charitable fuel distributions during particularly harsh winters, while guild accounts show provisions for widows of former members. The sharing of hearth fires themselves, allowing neighbours to take embers to start their own fires, rather than using precious tinder represented one of the most basic forms of winter cooperation. Medieval households carefully calibrated their fuel use throughout winter. Different types of wood served different purposes. Quick-burning varieties like pine or birch for morning fires to take the edge off the overnight chill, longer-lasting oak or beech for sustained heating. The careful banking of fires overnight covering coals with ashes to maintain minimal heat without consuming fuel became a crucial skill. A properly banked fire could smoulder until morning, when it would be uncovered and fed fresh fuel, avoiding the need to start anew with valuable tinder and kindling. The architecture of medieval buildings increasingly reflected awareness of fuel efficiency. While early medieval halls featured central hearths with heat escaping through roof vents, later designs incorporated chimneys that improved draft while minimizing heat loss. Interior walls and hanging tapestries created smaller spaces that required less heating. Innovations like the inglenook, a recessed area around the fireplace, where people could sit directly within the fire's radiating warmth, allowed comfort without needing to heat entire rooms. As winters deepened, medieval communities implemented increasingly stringent fuel conservation measures. Night temperatures in most homes dropped dramatically as fires were banked or extinguished completely. Family members shared beds not merely for lack of space but for essential warmth, often sleeping fully clothed under layers of woolen blankets and furs. In the coldest regions, households sometimes moved livestock indoors, utilizing animal body heat to supplement precious fuel. The winter fuel cycle gathering, managing, conserving, and sharing embodies the medieval understanding that survival required both careful resource management and community cooperation. Each log in the woodpile, each block of peat, each carefully banked coal represented not just potential warmth, but the forethought and collective wisdom that allowed medieval communities to endure winter after winter, preserving both their lives and their carefully tended resources for generations to come. As winter settled across the medieval landscape, its icy touch reached all levels of society, yet the experience of winter varied dramatically, depending on one's position in the social order. While the fundamental challenges of cold, darkness, and scarcity affected everyone, the means to address these challenges differed profoundly across social boundaries, creating winter experiences as stratified as society itself. For the nobility, winter brought inconveniences rather than existential threats. Within the thick stone walls of castles and manor houses, aristocratic families enjoyed relative comfort unknown to their social inferiors. Multiple fireplaces, gradually introduced throughout the high medieval period, warmed the private chambers of the wealthy. While commoners might huddle around a single hearth, noble households maintained fires in several rooms, with servants dedicated solely to the task of keeping these fires burning day and night. The great hall of a lordly estate might consume an entire cartload of wood, daily more fuel than a peasant household might use in a month. The clothing of the aristocracy provided further insulation against winter's assault. Noble winter garments incorporated multiple layers of the finest wool and linen, often lined with expensive furs. Sable, ermine, and fox harvested from northern forests, and acquired through long-distance trade networks, adorned the winter cloaks and hoods of the wealthy. These materials combined excellent insulation with visible markers of status, transforming winter survival gear into fashion statements. For a medieval nobleman or lady, winter clothing served not merely to retain bodily warmth, but to display wealth and reinforce social distinctions even in the coldest months. The noble winter diet maintained variety even when fields lay dormant under snow. Castle stores contained imported spices, dried fruits, and preserved delicacies that brought colour and flavour to winter meals. Hunting, a privilege reserved for the aristocracy in most regions, provided fresh meat throughout the season. While commoners subsisted on increasingly stale bread and depleting stores of dried vegetables, nobles might feast on venison, wild boar, or game birds taken from protected forests. Wine cellars ensured that even midwinter feasts could flow with abundant drink, the alcohol providing both warmth and escape from winter's tedium. Winter sociability among the elite included elaborate feasting cycles, particularly around Christmas and other winter festivals. These gatherings served multiple purposes, reinforcing social bonds, demonstrating generosity through hospitality, and relieving the psychological burden of winter isolation. Music, storytelling, and games helped pass the long evenings, with professional entertainers often retained specifically for the winter season. In stark contrast, the rural peasantry experienced winter as a period of genuine hardship and vulnerability. Their homes, typically timber-framed structures with walls of wattle and daub, offered minimal insulation against freezing temperatures. Unlike the multiple hearths of noble residences, a single central fire provided the only heating, its smoke often inadequately vented through thatched roofs. Families crowded together at night for warmth, sleeping fully clothed under whatever blankets and furs they possessed. When fuel ran low, which it often did during long winters, choices became dire. Burn precious wooden implements and furniture, venture into freezing weather to gather more wood, often illegally from the Lord's forest, or endure the potentially deadly cold. Peasant winter clothing relied on coarse, homespun wool layered for warmth rather than appearance. While functional, these garments lacked the insulating properties of the finer materials available to the wealthy. Footwear became particularly problematic. Poorly waterproofed leather shoes offered little protection against snow and slush, while wooden pattens, overshoes, made walking treacherous on ice. The poorest might wrap their feet in rags for additional insulation, a practice that provided minimal protection against winter's wet chill. The winter diet of the rural poor grew increasingly monotonous as stores depleted. By January, many subsisted primarily on bread and pottage, thick soup of whatever grains and vegetables remained in storage. Protein became scarce as winter deepened, with meat a rare luxury saved for special occasions. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly scurvy from lack of fresh produce, became common by late winter, manifesting in bleeding gums, joint pain, and poor wound healing. The timing of Lent occurring at winter's end when food stores were most depleted intensified this seasonal deprivation by imposing dietary restrictions precisely when nutrition was already compromised. Between these extremes stood the urban middle classes, merchants, skilled artisans, and professionals whose winter experience combined elements of both comfort and hardship. Townhouses, often built of more substantial materials than rural cottages, provided better insulation against cold. The concentration of dwellings in urban settings created mutual shelter, with shared walls conserving heat more efficiently than freestanding rural structures. Municipal regulations in some cities required homeowners to clear snow from streets before their properties, creating safer passage through winter's obstacles, while the proximity of neighbours ensured help was nearby when winter illnesses struck. The urban marketplace provided food security unavailable in isolated rural settings. Even in winter, city markets operated regularly, bringing in provisions from surrounding countryside and through long-distance trade. Bakers continued producing fresh bread when rural households relied on increasingly stale loaves from autumn baking. Butchers offered meat throughout the season, allowing urban dwellers with sufficient means to maintain more protein in their winter diet than their rural counterparts. Regional variations added another dimension to winter's social stratification. The experience of winter in Mediterranean Europe differed markedly from that in the north. While a Scandinavian peasant might face months of deep snow and temperatures well below freezing, their southern counterparts in Sicily or Andalusia experienced milder conditions with only occasional frost. These climatic differences shaped everything from architecture to clothing to winter activities. Northern buildings featured steeply pitched roofs to shed snow, while southern structures prioritized summer cooling over winter warmth. Gender created additional layers of winter differentiation across all social classes. Women's winter responsibilities typically centered on indoor activities, spinning, weaving, food preparation, and childcare, that kept them closer to hearth fires and thus somewhat warmer than men whose duties often required outdoor work, even in harsh conditions. Yet women also faced unique winter challenges, particularly the difficulty of laundering clothes and linens when water sources froze and drying became problematic. The care of winter infants presented special concerns, with swaddling practices developed specifically to protect babies from cold while allowing necessary movement. This stratification of winter experience reinforced and sometimes amplified existing social divisions. The visible contrast between a nobleman on horseback, wrapped in furs against the cold, and a shivering peasant trudging through snow in threadbare woolens provided stark testimony to medieval inequality. Yet winter also occasionally created moments of social levelling. The nobleman caught in a sudden blizzard far from shelter faced the same mortal threat as any peasant, regardless of rank or privilege. Winter's fundamental challenges transcended social boundaries even as the resources to meet those challenges remained unequally distributed across medieval society. In the depths of medieval winter, when daylight fled by mid-afternoon and bitter winds howled around thatched roofs, communities across Europe created moments of warmth, light, and celebration that punctuated the season's darkness. These winter festivals served purposes far beyond mere entertainment. They provided psychological sustenance through the bleakest months, reinforced community bonds when isolation threatened, and marked the rhythmic passage of time when nature itself seemed frozen and unchanging. Winter celebrations followed the Christian liturgical calendar, yet beneath their religious veneer lay older patterns of observance tied to agricultural cycles and astronomical events. The winter solstice, that longest night after which daylight begins its gradual return, formed the foundation upon which many celebrations were built. Early medieval Christians, recognizing the power of this moment, positioned Christmas near the solstice, transforming the primeval recognition of light's return into celebration of divine birth. Christmas in medieval times bore little resemblance to its modern counterpart. The day began with attendance at dawn mass, often requiring villagers to trudge through snow by torchlight to reach their parish church. Bells would ring across the frozen landscape, their sound carrying farther in the dense winter air than during any other season. Inside stone churches, candles illuminated breath visible in the cold, while priests recounted the nativity story to congregations huddled in their warmest clothing. The religious observance completed, Christmas celebrations turned toward feasting, though the scale varied dramatically across social classes. For nobility, Christmas brought spectacular displays of consumption, great halls decorated with evergreens, tables laden with roasted meats, and elaborate subtleties, sculptured dishes, designed to impress guests. Court records describe Christmas feasts where hundreds of bird swans, peacocks, geese, and tiny songbirds appeared on aristocratic tables alongside venison, boar, and elaborate pastries. For common folk, Christmas meant more modest, yet still significant celebrations. The Yule log, carefully selected and dried for months to ensure slow, steady burning, was ceremoniously lit, often large enough to smoulder for the entire 12 days of Christmas. Peasant households might save precious ingredients throughout autumn to prepare special bread or porridge. Even the poorest families typically managed to secure some meat for this feast day, often from communal arrangements where villages slaughtered animals that could not be fed through winter. The 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany, January 6th, represented a continuous festive season, with work reduced to essential maintenance. This period included several notable observances. St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, often featured blessing of horses and ceremonial riding. Holy Innocents' Day, December 28th, sometimes saw children temporarily granted authority over households. And New Year's brought exchanges of modest gifts and promises of good fortune. January 6th, the Feast of Epiphany, celebrated as the day the Magi visited the Christ child, marked the conclusion of the Christmas season. In many regions, it became an occasion for blessing homes and marking doorways with chalk inscriptions of the new year, and initials C plus Asper Sanctus B for the traditional names of the Magist Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. This practice, which continued into modern times in some rural areas, represented a ritualized protection of the household against winter's dangers. As January deepened toward February, Candlemas, February 2nd, brought another significant winter observance. Churches filled with hundreds of candles, their light symbolizing Christ as light of the world, while practically demonstrating the lengthening days. Candlemas combined religious significance with practical timing by early February. Winter stores had diminished significantly, yet spring remained distant. The festival provided psychological encouragement at precisely the moment when winter seemed interminable. Perhaps the most distinctive winter celebration developed in the days before Lent. Carnival, from Latin carnvale or farewell to meat, emerged as winter's most boisterous festivity during the High Middle Ages. Before the 40-day Lenten fast began, communities indulged in feasting, drinking, dancing, and ritualized social inversion. Masked revelers, role reversal between social classes, and temporary suspension of normal behavioral constraints created a psychological release valve during winter's final weeks. Carnival celebrations varied enormously by region. In German lands, wild men covered in furs and bells chased onlookers through village streets. In Italian cities, elaborate pageant wagons displayed mythological and religious scenes. Throughout Europe, mock battles between personified winter and spring enacted the seasonal transition. These performances contained layers of meaning entertainment certainly, but also communal exorcism of winter's accumulated frustrations and anxieties. Beyond these major celebrations, winter's passage was marked by dozens of saints' days with specific seasonal associations. St. Nicholas, December 6th, became increasingly connected with gift-giving, particularly for children. St. Lucy's Day, December 13th, celebrated light during the darkest time of year, with young girls wearing candle crowns in Scandinavian regions. St. Agnes, January 21st, was associated with young women's divination of future husbands, often through dreams on this winter night. St. Valentine gradually became associated with courtship, providing midwinter occasions for romance and pledges between couples. Throughout these varied celebrations, practical considerations remained tightly interwoven with spiritual observance and social custom. Many winter festivals coincided with agricultural necessities. Martinmas, November 11th, marked traditional slaughter time when animals unlikely to survive winter were culled. Christmas utilised resources from this slaughter, now preserved through smoking and salting. Carnival consumed remaining stores before spring scarcity. The religious calendar thus reinforced practical rural patterns through sacred associations. Winter festivities served several critical psychological functions. They provided structured markers breaking winter's monotony into manageable segments. They created moments of sensory richness, light, warmth, flavour, sound and movement during nature's most sensory-deprived season. They strengthened community bonds through shared experiences when isolation presented the greatest threat, and they offered reassurance that winter, however harsh, remained a temporary trial within a cosmic order that promised eventual renewal. For medieval people, winter celebrations were not mere distractions from seasonal hardship, but essential components of survival, strategy sustaining hope when daylight waned, preserving social cohesion when physical connection became difficult, and maintaining faith in spring's eventual return when evidence of life seemed most remote. Through feasting, ritual, performance, and prayer, medieval communities transformed winter from an endurance test into a season with its own distinctive character and meaning, a time when darkness made light more precious, when scarcity enhanced appreciation of abundance, and when isolation deepened the significance of human gathering. While medieval people battled winter's physical challenges through practical adaptations, they simultaneously processed their experiences of the cold season through artistic expression. Winter left its mark not just on bodies and landscapes, but on the medieval imagination, appearing in illuminated manuscripts, poetry, songs, and stories that have survived the centuries. These cultural artifacts reveal how the medieval mind understood, feared, and sometimes even celebrated the season of darkness and cold. In visual art, winter initially appeared primarily through the practical lens of the labours of the months. Church calendars and illuminated books of hours prayer guides for the devout often featured 12 scenes showing typical seasonal activities. Winter months depicted slaughtering pigs in November, feasting by the fire in December, and warming hands before hearths in January and February. The famous Très riche Heure du Duc de Berry, created in the early 15th century, represents the pinnacle of this tradition. Its February illustration shows peasants warming themselves before a fire in a rustic cottage, their bodies hunched against cold, their outer garments removed to absorb the precious heat, while outside, snow blankets the landscape and neighbours go about essential winter tasks. This practical depiction gradually evolved into more atmospheric portrayals as the medieval period progressed. Late medieval Flemish painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder captured winter landscapes with remarkable attention to detail. Frozen ponds bearing skaters, snow-laden trees, and villagers trudging through drifts. Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow, 1565, while just beyond the traditional medieval period, represents the culmination of this tradition, showing hunters returning home across a snow-covered valley, their posture conveying exhaustion, while village life continues with skating and games on frozen ponds below. Such paintings captured the paradoxical nature of winter, its deadly potential, alongside moments of community recreation. Manuscript illumination, the medieval art form most accessible to modern viewers, reveals the season's symbolic dimensions. Winter scenes often employ a distinctive palette whites and greys for snow and ice, with stark black tree trunks standing bare against pale backgrounds. Gold leaf, used to represent divine light in religious imagery, becomes particularly effective in winter scenes, gleaming against cold colours to suggest warmth and hope amid desolation. A 14th century Book of Hours shows December as an elderly man warming his feet before a fire, his bent form echoing the cycle of the year drawing to its close. Winter rarely appeared in the grand stone sculptures of medieval cathedrals, where symbolic rather than seasonal imagery predominated. However, in the Misericord small wooden carvings beneath choir seats, winter activities occasionally appear in charming detail. At Beverley Minster in England, a 14th century Misericord shows a figure warming his hands at a fire, while another carving depicts a traveller with snowshoes trudging through drifts. In literature, winter played both literal and metaphorical roles. Anglo-Saxon poetry, with its heritage from northern Europe's harsh climate, frequently employed winter imagery as both setting and metaphor. The 10th century poem The Wanderer presents a stark emotional landscape through winter imagery. Earth's embrace grows cold, laments the narrator, an exile who has lost his lord and community. The literal winter merges with spiritual winter loss, desolation, and loneliness. Similarly, in The Seafarer, winter at sea becomes the ultimate adversary. My feet were bound by frost in cold clasps, while cares seethed hot around my heart. This tradition continued into later medieval literature. The 14th century alliterative poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight uses winter as both setting and symbolic challenge. When Gawain journeys to meet the Green Knight, the poet dedicates substantial verses to describing the winter landscape he traverses. When the cold, clear water from the clouds shed down, and freezes before it can fall to the fallow earth, near slain with the sleet, he sleeps in his irons more nights than enough in naked rocks. Winter here functions as the external manifestation of Gawain's spiritual trial, harsh, unforgiving, and inescapable. Even Chaucer, who opens his Canterbury Tales with April's sweet showers, acknowledges winter's power in the Knight's Tale, where the season becomes personified. The frosty season, the bitter cold winter, that bloweth through the hair and every horn. This tradition of personifying winter as an old man with icicle beard would continue through the medieval period and beyond. For the troubadours and minnesingers, medieval Europe's professional poet-musicians' winter provided a conventional opening for many songs. The 12th century troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn begins one composition. When I see the lark beat his wings against the sun's ray, until, for the sweetness that enters his heart, he forgets himself and lets himself fall. Such great envy comes to me of those whom I see rejoicing. I wonder that my heart does not melt at once from desire. This convention of winter opening offered a stark contrast to the warmth of the love the poet would proceed to describe. Religious texts employed winter primarily as metaphor. The barrenness of winter landscapes paralleled spiritual desolation, while the promise of spring's eventual return offered hope of spiritual renewal. In sermon literature, winter often represented the sinner's condition before grace, or the world's state before Christ's return. The 12th century mystic Hildegard of Bingen wrote of the soul in winter. The soul sometimes sees in itself the dark of winter, but remembers that after winter comes spring. Winter also appeared in medieval dream visions, allegorical poems where narrators fall asleep and experience symbolic landscapes. The Roman de la Rose, a 13th century French poem widely read throughout Europe, begins with the poet dreaming of a garden in May, explicitly contrasting it with the winter outside his window. This juxtaposition of winter reality with dreamspring underscored medieval understanding of winter as a time when life retreated inward, prompting introspection and imagination. Perhaps most significant was winter's role in medieval drama, particularly in the cycle plays performed in towns across Europe. Winter festivals like Christmas became occasions for dramatic performances that brought biblical narratives to life. The Second Shepherd's Play, part of the Wakefield cycle, opens with shepherds complaining bitterly about winter weather before witnessing Christ's birth. Their transition from winter suffering to spiritual joy made concrete the metaphorical connection between physical and spiritual conditions that underpinned medieval understanding. Through these artistic expressions, visual, literary, musical, and dramatic medieval people processed their complex relationship with winter. Art transformed the season from mere survival challenge to meaningful experience, invested with spiritual significance. While their bodies might shiver in underheated halls, their imaginations created worlds where winter's hardships yielded deeper understanding of human frailty, endurance, and hope. This cultural legacy, preserved in manuscript, stone, paint, and verse, allows us to glimpse how our ancestors understood the colder season, not merely as physical condition, but as state of soul. As the medieval world confronted winter's bitter trials, religious understanding provided a framework through which to interpret both suffering and survival. The stark reality of winter, its darkness, cold, and scarcity, became deeply interwoven with spiritual meaning, offering medieval people not merely explanations for their hardships, but pathways through them. The seasonal cycle of death and rebirth embedded in winter's passage aligned naturally with Christian themes of suffering, endurance, and resurrection. Winter hardship was frequently interpreted as divine testing, a purification of the soul through physical trial. Sermons from the period frequently compared winter's cold to the refining fire that purges impurities from precious metals. A 13th century homily preserved in the Lambeth Palace manuscript states that, as winter's frost cleanses the earth of vermin and corruption, so too does God cleanse the faithful through seasonal hardship. The concept that suffering served a spiritual purpose provided comfort during the leanest months, suggesting that physical deprivation might yield spiritual abundance. Monasteries, those centres of medieval religious thought, developed sophisticated theological interpretations of winter's challenges. The Benedictine rule already incorporated seasonal variations in fasting requirements, acknowledging that bodies required more sustenance during winter labour. Yet beyond these practical accommodations, monastic writers explored winter symbolism extensively. The 12th century mystic Hildegard of Bingen described the soul's winter season as a necessary period of interior stillness when outward growth ceased but inner contemplation deepened. The barren tree in winter gathers strength unseen, she wrote, as the faithful soul in hardship gathers God's grace. Religious calendars structured the winter season through feasts that punctuated the darkest months with moments of celebration and meaning. The careful placement of these observances, St. Martin's Day as winter began, Christmas near the solstice, Candlemas as the first hints of light's return appeared, created a spiritual pathway through the season. Each feast brought not only religious observance but practical charity. St. Nicholas Day traditions included gift-giving to children, while St. Thomas Day, December 23rd, was widely observed as a time when the poor could go a-Thomasing requesting food donations from wealthier households as a recognised right rather than mere begging. Parish churches served as winter sanctuaries in multiple senses. Though rarely heated, their thick stone walls offered some protection from biting winds. More importantly, they provided spaces where communities gathered regularly, maintaining social bonds during a season when isolation threatened. Winter masses might see parishioners standing close together for warmth, their collective breath visible in the cold air as they recited familiar prayers. This physical closeness during worship reinforced community precisely when winter hardship might otherwise have turned households inward in self-preservation. Medieval Christianity interpreted winter weather events through providential frameworks. Unusually severe winters might be seen as divine punishment for communal sin, prompting public acts of penance and reconciliation. A chronicle from the monastery of St. Albans describes how during the extraordinarily harsh winter of 1205, the people walked barefoot through snow to the church, fasting and lamenting, begging God's mercy for whatever sins had brought such bitter cold upon them. Conversely, mild winter days might be interpreted as divine blessing, acknowledged with thanksgiving processions. Winter saints received particular veneration during their season. St. Lucy, December 13th, whose name derived from the Latin for light, was celebrated with candlelit processions during the darkest days. St. Scholastica, sister of St. Benedict and patroness against storms, was invoked during winter tempests. Regional winter saints addressed local concerns. Alpine communities venerated St. Bernard of Menthon as protector of mountain travellers caught in winter storms, while Scandinavian Christians sought intercession from St. Thorlak against the North Atlantic's winter fury. Religious institutions played crucial practical roles during winter hardship. Monasteries maintained winter guest houses where travellers caught in storms could find shelter. Many religious houses doubled their charitable food distribution during winter months. The Cistercian customary explicitly required that, from All Saints' Day until Easter, no poor person coming to the gate shall be sent away without food, even if local resources grow thin. This winter charity was considered a spiritual obligation, not merely optional generosity. The theological concept of stewardship, that the fortunate were obligated to care for those in need as part of divine ordering, found heightened expression during winter months. Parish priests reminded wealthy parishioners that hoarding resources while others froze or starved endangered their souls. A 14th century sermon collection from York contains this admonition. He who has 2 cloaks while his neighbour shivers, or who feasts while another starves in the winter cold, stores not wealth in his barn, but judgment upon his soul. Winter also influenced confessional practices. The season was associated with sins of despair, anger, and uncharitableness that might emerge under winter's strain. Penitential manuals from the period show confessors were instructed to inquire whether hardship had led parishioners to curse God, hoard necessities from neighbours, or surrender to despair. These winter-specific spiritual dangers required particular pastoral attention. The interpretation of winter suffering varied somewhat between social classes. For the elite, winter discomfort was often framed as voluntary asceticism, an opportunity to experience, however mildly, the deprivation that Christ endured. Noble households might observe winter as a season of increased almsgiving and moderate self-denial. For the peasantry, whose winter suffering was involuntary and often severe, religious teaching emphasized endurance and the promise of eventual relief, both seasonal and eschatological. Perhaps most fundamentally, religious understanding provided medieval people with a sense that winter, however harsh, remained within a divinely ordered framework. The predictable return of spring offered tangible hope and a metaphor for spiritual renewal. Winter was never meaningless suffering, but part of a cycle that included restoration. The Easter season that eventually followed winter's trials embodied this pattern of death yielding to new life. Through liturgical rhythms, saintly intercessions, charitable obligations, and theological frameworks, medieval religion transformed winter from mere meteorological hardship into a spiritually significant season. Winter became not simply something to endure, but something to interpret a text written in snow and frost, through which one might discern deeper meanings. This spiritual reading of winter's hardships provided medieval people with resources beyond the material, offering hope and meaning during the darkest and coldest days of the year. The medieval winter, with its short days and long nights, transformed not only how people worked, but also how they played. As darkness fell by mid-afternoon and cold confined many indoors until morning light, communities developed a rich tapestry of recreational activities that served purposes beyond mere amusement. These winter pastimes strengthened social bonds, transmitted cultural knowledge, maintained psychological well-being, and provided practical skills during a season when isolation and melancholy might otherwise have flourished. Indoor games occupied a central place in winter recreation across all social classes, though their specific forms varied widely. The nobility might pass winter evenings playing chess, a game that had entered Europe through Islamic Spain and Italy, gradually spreading northward. Chess sets of the period, carved from bone, ivory or wood, featured pieces whose forms had been adapted to European understanding, the Islamic vizier becoming the queen, the elephant transforming into the bishop. Medieval chess differed somewhat from its modern descendant, with more limited movement for certain pieces, but its strategic essence remained. Tables, an ancestor of backgammon, proved equally popular among the elite, combining chance and strategy as players moved their pieces according to dice rolls. Gambling frequently accompanied such games, with accounts describing nobles wagering substantial sums on their outcomes. For those with less refined tastes, dice games flourished despite periodic prohibitions from both secular and religious authorities. Simple games of chance required minimal equipment and could be played even in the dimmest firelight, making them ubiquitous from castle halls to village taverns. The lower classes developed their own gaming traditions, often requiring little equipment but considerable skill. Ninemen's Morris, played by scratching a board into a table or hearthstone and using pebbles or beans as pieces, appears frequently in archaeological contexts across medieval Europe. Various forms of fox and geese pursuit games, where one player with a single piece attempts to capture multiple opponent pieces, could be improvised with whatever materials were at hand. Physical games moved indoors during winter as well. Wrestling matches beside the Great Hall fire provided entertainment and settled disputes. Hot cockles, where a blindfolded player had to identify who had struck them, and hoodman blind, an early form of blindman's buff, generated physical contact, warmth, and laughter during cold evenings. Beyond games, storytelling reached its pinnacle during winter nights. Communities across medieval Europe reserved their richest oral traditions for the season, when darkness provided the perfect backdrop for tales of heroes, saints, monsters, and marvels. In Scandinavian cultures, the winter custom of kveldvaka, evening wake, gathered households together as one person read from sagas while others worked at necessary indoor tasks. Similar traditions appeared across Europe under different names, but with the same fundamental purpose-transmitting cultural knowledge while binding communities together through shared narrative experience. These storytelling sessions served practical purposes beyond entertainment. Tales often encoded information about genealogy, land boundaries, and proper behavior. The human mind retains information more effectively when embedded in narrative, making winter's stories a crucial educational tool in largely illiterate societies. For children, these tales provided cultural orientation and practical knowledge disguised as entertainment during the enforced indoor confinement of winter evenings. Music provided another vital winter pastime. From the sophisticated performances by trained musicians in noble courts to the communal singing in village gatherings, winter nights resonated with sound. Simple instruments pipes fashioned from reeds, drums made of stretched hide, stringed instruments of varying complexity accompanied voices in songs that marked the season or simply passed the time. Dancing, though somewhat constrained by indoor spaces, continued through winter as well, providing physical warmth alongside social connection. Productive crafts blurred the line between work and recreation during winter evenings. Women gathered for communal spinning and weaving, transforming necessary labour into social occasion. Men carved wood, repaired tools, or crafted items for trade or household use. These work parties, known by different regional terms like bees in English or Spinnstuben in German contexts, combined productivity with entertainment as participants sang, told stories, or engaged in word games while their hands remained busy with practical tasks. When weather permitted, medieval people enthusiastically embraced outdoor winter activities. Ice skating emerged as a practical transportation method that evolved into recreation. Early skates fashioned from polished animal bone, strapped to boots with leather thongs, appear in archaeological contexts from the 8th century onward. By the 13th century, wooden skates with iron runners had appeared in the Low Countries, allowing faster and more controlled movement across frozen lakes, rivers and canals. A Dutch chronicler from the period describes children and adults alike flying like birds across frozen waterways. Sledding served both practical and recreational purposes. Simple sleds transported goods across snow-covered ground with less effort than wheeled carts required, but soon became instruments of play as well. Children and adventurous adults would slide down hillsides on everything from purpose-built wooden sledges to repurposed shields, barrel staves or animal shoulder blades. Bruegel's famous 16th century paintings depicting winter scenes show such activities were well established by the late medieval period. Snowball fights and snow sculpture required no equipment beyond what nature provided. Medieval illuminations occasionally depict formal snow battles between groups of youths, sometimes with mock castles constructed of snow and defended against assault by opponents. Such activities built community bonds while providing physical exertion during a season when agricultural work diminished. Winter hunting took specialised forms. Tracking animals through snow offered advantages, as footprints revealed what the forest might otherwise keep hidden. Nobles pursued deer and boar through winter forests, while commoners might set traps for rabbits and other small game when permitted by local hunting rights. Ice fishing provided both recreation and valuable protein during the leanest months, with specialised tools developed for cutting holes and attracting fish in frozen lakes and rivers. The psychological importance of these winter pastimes cannot be overstated. In an era without artificial lighting or modern entertainment, winter's extended darkness posed significant challenges to mental well-being. Recreational activities combated isolation, maintained community cohesion, and provided structure during months when agricultural rhythms relaxed their hold on daily life. The communal nature of medieval winter recreation, whether gathered around a noble's fire or a village hearth, ensured that even the darkest season remained illuminated by human connection, creativity, and play. In a world without satellite imagery, computer models, or meteorological instruments, medieval people faced the daunting challenge of preparing for winter with only their accumulated observational knowledge and inherited wisdom. Their survival depended not merely on responding to winter's arrival, but on anticipating its severity months in advance. This predictive knowledge, refined through generations of experience, created a sophisticated if scientifically ungrounded system for reading nature's signals. The medieval approach to weather forecasting blended careful natural observation with folklore, religious interpretation, and astronomical understanding. Perhaps most fundamental were the biological indicators observed during late summer and autumn. The thickness of animal coats provided crucial clues. Particularly thick fur on livestock, wild animals, and even household pets signalled a harsh winter ahead. Hunters noted whether bears and squirrels built more substantial dens or gathered unusually large stores of nuts, taking these as warnings to increase their own preparations. Plant life offered equally important signals. Medieval farmers observed that unusually thick husks on grain, deep-set onion skins, or abundant nuts on trees all pointed toward a severe season approaching. The Old English proverb, "A plentiful berry crop means a cold winter to come," reflects this observational wisdom. The height at which hornets built their nests, presumably to escape anticipated snow accumulation, was noted with special attention. These natural indicators formed a complex predictive system transmitted through generations via oral tradition. Astronomical and meteorological observations provided another layer of predictive knowledge. Medieval people tracked the first frost dates, noting that early frosts often heralded longer, harsher winters. They observed wind patterns during specific days, particularly around religious festivals that served as calendrical markers. A north wind on Michaelmas, September 29th, was widely interpreted as a sign of a severe winter approaching. The clarity of stars on certain autumn nights was thought to predict the season's harshness. "Clear stars, harsh winter," as one medieval English saying put it. The behaviour of migratory birds received particular attention. with early departures signalling earlier onset of cold weather. Rural communities carefully noted when swallows, geese, and other migratory species began their southern journey, using this information to adjust harvesting schedules and winter preparation timelines. Similarly, the arrival of certain winter birds from northern regions like fieldfares and redwings in England was interpreted as a warning that harsh conditions had already developed further north. Religious calendars provided a framework for these observations, with specific saints' days serving as benchmarks for weather prediction. St. Martin's Day, November 11th, held special significance, with clear weather on this day supposedly indicating a harsh winter ahead. Similarly, conditions on Candlemas, February 2nd, were thought to predict whether winter would linger or give way to early spring, a belief that survives in modified form in modern Groundhog Day traditions. Beyond informal observation, more systematic approaches developed in educated circles. By the late medieval period, almanacs combined astronomical observations, weather records, and predictive law into written guides. Monastic chronicles often included weather records stretching back decades, allowing for rudimentary pattern recognition. While lacking modern meteorological understanding, these systems nonetheless represented serious attempts at long-term weather prediction, based on accumulated data. The predictions gleaned through these diverse methods directly influence practical planning. A forecast of severe winter would prompt communities to gather additional firewood, ensure deeper stockpiling of preserved foods, reinforce animal shelters, and repair dwellings more thoroughly before the first snowfall. Conversely, predictions of a mild winter might allow resources to be allocated differently, perhaps preserving less food, but investing more in winter planting or construction projects that would be feasible in less extreme conditions. Regional variations in predictive methods reflected local environmental conditions. Coastal communities paid special attention to seabirds' behavior and ocean conditions, while mountain dwellers observed snowlines on distant peaks and the migration timing of wildlife to lower elevations. These regionally specific systems acknowledged the dramatically different winter challenges faced across Europe's varied landscapes. The accuracy of medieval weather prediction undoubtedly fell far short of modern capabilities, yet within these limitations the system possessed notable strengths. The decentralized observational approach meant that thousands of individuals constantly monitored subtle environmental changes across diverse indicators. Modern research has confirmed that some traditional predictors like animal coat thickness and certain plant characteristics do correlate with winter severity due to complex environmental cues that animals and plants detect before humans perceive weather changes. When predictions proved wrong, as they inevitably sometimes did, the consequences could be dire. A winter more severe than anticipated might exhaust carefully rationed food stores or fuel supplies before spring arrived. Conversely, over-preparing for a harsh winter that proved mild represented a different kind of waste resources that might have been used elsewhere. The most prudent communities hedged their predictions, preparing for somewhat worse conditions than forecasted, while maintaining flexibility to adapt as the season progressed. This ancient system of weather prediction and planning represents one of medieval civilization's most remarkable practical adaptations. Without scientific instruments or understanding of atmospheric physics, communities nonetheless developed methods to peer, however imperfectly, into the meteorological future, reading nature's subtle signals to anticipate winter's severity. The predictive folklore that emerged from this necessity, preserved in proverbs, planting guides, and household wisdom, continued to influence rural life long after the medieval period ended, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of winter's unpredictable challenges. The medieval experience of winter was not merely an individual struggle, but a communal challenge met through sophisticated systems of cooperation that bound villages, towns, and cities together during the harshest months. Behind the scattered homesteads and castle walls, a complex web of mutual obligations, shared resources, and collective decision-making helped communities endure the season that threatened all with cold, hunger, and isolation. The village, as the fundamental unit of rural life, developed the most comprehensive winter cooperation systems. The Anglo-Saxon concept of Frith-Guild peace association evolved into various formal and informal arrangements, ensuring mutual support when resources grew scarce. Many communities maintained a communal grain reserve, sometimes called the hunger barn or winter store, filled through mandatory contributions at harvest time. This reserve served multiple purposes: seed grain for spring planting, emergency provisions during unexpected shortages, and support for the destitute who had exhausted their personal stores. Management of these reserves followed carefully developed customs that balanced individual needs against communal survival. Village councils or elders determined distribution schedules, often releasing small amounts weekly during late winter when private supplies began dwindling. Records from the Manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire show that in the harsh winter of 1316, during the Great Famine, the village's common store distributed grain to 37 households over 8 weeks, possibly saving numerous lives when private stores failed. Beyond formal reserves, the boonwork system created a framework for sharing labour during crucial winter tasks. When a household needed to repair a roof damaged by snow or rebuild a collapsed animal shelter, neighbours would gather for a day's collaborative labour. This assistance was not charity but a form of mutual insurance. The receiving household was expected to provide food and drink during the work, and to reciprocate when others needed similar help. Through this rotating system of support, communities maintained their collective infrastructure without any single household bearing impossible burdens. The winter slaughter of livestock created another opportunity for community cooperation. Few households could consume an entire pig or cow before the meat spoiled, even with preservation methods. Instead, a complex system of meat sharing developed. When a family slaughtered an animal, portions were distributed to neighbours according to established patterns, with the understanding that these gifts would be reciprocated when neighbours slaughtered their own animals. This rotation ensured that families had access to fresh meat periodically throughout the winter, rather than feast-then-famine cycles. Fuel gathering and management similarly relied on cooperative arrangements. Villages with access to woodlands often organised collective expeditions to gather and transport winter fuel, utilising shared draft animals and carts to maximise efficiency. The resulting wood piles might be divided according to household size and need, or in some regions maintained as a communal resource from which families could draw according to established quotas. In areas where peat served as the primary fuel, the cutting, drying and stacking became community endeavours during summer and autumn, with the winter drawing rights carefully allocated by eldership councils. Winter road maintenance required particularly organised cooperation. After heavy snows, able-bodied villagers were expected to help clear critical paths to water sources, mills and neighbouring settlements. The pattern of snow clearing often followed a hierarchy of necessity. First the path to water, then to the mill, then connections to other villages, and finally internal village lanes. This prioritisation emerged not through formal regulations but through generations of practical experience with winter's challenges. In urban settings, guilds assumed many of the cooperative functions that villages managed communally. Guild charters frequently included provisions for supporting members during winter hardship. The Tanners Guild of York, for example, maintained a separate winter fund that provided fuel allowances to elderly members and widows of former guildsmen. Similar arrangements appeared in guild regulations across Europe, creating a form of early social insurance against winter destitution. Religious institutions formalised many winter support systems. Parish churches maintained poor chests, funds specifically designated for winter relief within the community. Monastic almsgiving increased during the coldest months, often providing both food and fuel to surrounding populations. In some regions, monasteries operated what amounted to winter shelters, offering temporary accommodations during the harshest weather to travellers and the homeless poor. Family and kinship networks formed perhaps the most fundamental layer of winter cooperation. Extended families typically clustered in nearby dwellings, sharing resources, labour and living space during winter emergencies. The elderly, with their accumulated knowledge of past winters, provided crucial expertise in weather prediction and resource management, while the young and strong performed the physical labour of gathering fuel and clearing snow. This intergenerational cooperation maximised the survival knowledge and physical capabilities within family groups. Winter's challenges also shaped political structures within communities. Villages often appointed specific winter officials, wardens responsible for managing common resources during the scarcity season. These positions might rotate annually, spreading both the burden of responsibility and the authority that accompanied it. Decision-making about winter preparations frequently became more inclusive than governance during other seasons. As survival depended on coordinated action across all households, regional variations in cooperation systems reflected different environmental challenges. Alpine communities developed elaborate mutual aid arrangements for avalanche rescue and snow clearing, with clear responsibilities assigned to specific households along key routes. Coastal fishing villages established risk-sharing systems for winter fishing expeditions, dividing catches among all participating families regardless of which boat had the successful haul, thus distributing both risk and reward during the most dangerous season for seafaring. What unified these diverse cooperative mechanisms was the recognition that winter survival required transcending the self-sufficiency that might suffice during milder seasons. When darkness fell by mid-afternoon and snow transformed familiar landscapes into treacherous terrain, the boundaries between yours and mine necessarily softened. The harsh mathematics of survival in a pre-industrial winter left no room for absolute individualism. Only through collective action and resource sharing could communities emerge intact when spring finally arrived. As winter's grip tightened across medieval lands, it brought not just cold and hunger, but distinctive patterns of illness that medical practitioners came to recognize through generations of careful observation. The season of darkness and chill carried its own medical signature respiratory afflictions, joint pains, skin conditions and maladies unique to the coldest months demanded specialized knowledge and remedies developed specifically to combat winter's assault on human bodies. Medieval medical understanding founded on the ancient theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile saw winter as the season dominated by phlegm, cold and wet by nature. This physiological framework provided the theoretical foundation for winter treatments. Physicians believed that during winter, the body's internal heat retreated inward, leaving extremities vulnerable while concentrating digestive power. This explained both the frequent chilblains on fingers and toes and the increased winter appetite observed among healthy individuals. Respiratory illnesses dominated the winter medical landscape. The persistent cough that medieval texts called winter hack or frost cough represents what we would recognize as bronchitis, influenza, and the common cold. Treatments focused on warming the chest and thinning phlegm thought to obstruct breathing passages. Syrups made from horehound, coltsfoot, and licorice root plants harvested in summer, but preserved specifically for winter use, helped soothe irritated throats and suppress coughs. More serious lung infections, which medieval practitioners called lung rot, likely pneumonia, were treated with poultices of mustard seed applied to the chest, creating heat that supposedly drew infection outward. Medieval monasteries maintained detailed records of winter illnesses and their treatments. The infirmary garden at St. Gall in Switzerland grew specific winter simples, medicinal plants particularly effective against cold weather complaints. Monks preserved these remedies in the form of electries, medicine mixed with honey, tinctures in alcohol and dried herbs. The 9th century medical manuscript known as the Lorsch Pharmacopoeia lists over 30 preparations specifically designated for winter ailments, with careful instructions for their storage through warmer months. Winter joint pains received particular attention in medieval medical texts. What they termed winter stiffness, or cold ache, likely encompassed arthritis, rheumatism, and the muscle tensions that accompany prolonged exposure to cold. External applications of warming oils, particularly those infused with rosemary, bay, or juniper, were rubbed into affected joints. These oils, prepared during summer and autumn, represented another example of seasonal medical foresight. The 12th century abbess and medical writer Hildegard of Bingen recommended heated stones wrapped in wool and applied to painful joints, a treatment that combined the warmth-generating principles central to winter medicine. Chilblain's painful inflammations of small blood vessels in extremities represented perhaps the most distinctly winter-specific medical condition. Medieval practitioners recognized the characteristic red, itching swellings on fingers, toes, ears, and noses as winter bite, and understood that the condition worsened when cold limbs were warmed too rapidly. Their preventive advice showed sophisticated observation. Warm gradually what winter has frozen, lest greater harm come from hasty heat, cautioned a 13th century medical compendium from Salerno. Treatments included ointments containing onion juice, mustard oil, or animal fats, which increased circulation to affected areas. The skin presented numerous winter challenges beyond chilblains. Excessive indoor smoke exposure from winter fires led to eye inflammations and respiratory irritations. The alternating exposure to intense hearth heat and outdoor cold created facial roughening that texts called winter face. Preparations of lanolin, sheep's wool fat, beeswax and herbal infusions protected exposed skin. Wealthy individuals might apply almond oil mixed with rose water, while commoners relied on rendered animal fats, sometimes mixed with pine resin for greater protective properties. Winter darkness brought psychological challenges that medieval medicine recognized and addressed. The condition we now identify as seasonal affective disorder appears in medieval texts as winter melancholy or winter sadness. Treatments focused on balancing the humours through diet recommending warm, moist foods to counter the cold, dry nature of melancholy. St. John's wort, gathered at midsummer but dried for winter use, was brewed into teas for those suffering from winter despondency. Religious remedies supplemented herbal ones with prayers to St. Lucy, whose feast fell near winter solstice, specifically addressing the darkness of both season and spirit. Food itself served as winter medicine. The medieval adage that food properly chosen serves before apothecaries' potions guided winter nutrition. Carefully stored root vegetables, particularly onions and garlic, were valued for their warming properties. Preserved fruits, especially dried apples, featured in winter health regimens to cleanse the blood made sluggish by winter. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and pepper, expensive imports, reserved for the wealthy, served medicinal purposes by generating internal heat and aiding digestion during cold months. Winter childbirth received specialized attention in medieval medical knowledge. Midwives understood that keeping birthing rooms sufficiently warm was crucial, yet excessive smoke could harm newborn lungs. Careful preparations included gathered moss for insulation, clean cloths warmed before the fire, and herbal teas to strengthen mothers facing winter delivery. The lunar timing of birth was considered particularly important in winter, with children born under a waxing moon thought to have greater resistance to winter ailments. This accumulated winter medical wisdom was preserved through both written texts and oral tradition. While monastic infirmaries and urban physicians maintained written records, rural communities transmitted knowledge through practical apprenticeship and community memory. Village-wise women and cunning men, often dismissed by formal medicine, maintained sophisticated understanding of winter-specific treatments, their knowledge tested and refined through generations of cold seasons. By observing which plants reduced winter fevers, which applications eased chilblains, and which preventive measures reduced respiratory complaints, medieval practitioners developed a body of seasonal medical knowledge that, despite its theoretical foundations in humoral theory, contained substantial practical wisdom about surviving winter's distinct threats to human health. For medieval people, winter survival depended not merely on adequate preparation, but on practical skills honed through generations of experience. These were not abstract knowledge, but embodied wisdom, passed from parent to child through direct demonstration and practice. Unlike modern survival skills, taught as specialized knowledge for emergency situations, medieval winter skills formed part of ordinary seasonal life-familiar routines that everyone needed to master. Perhaps most fundamental was fire management in winter conditions. Starting and maintaining flame when everything was cold and potentially damp required sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques. Medieval people gathered and carefully stored tinder materials throughout the year: birch bark, certain fungi, especially the aptly named tinder fungus, dried grasses and fine wood shavings. These would be kept in waterproof containers, often made from waxed leather or hollowed gourds, and carried by travellers or maintained in special boxes near hearths. The skill of banking fires overnight, covering coals with ashes to maintain minimal heat, without consuming fuel, allowed precious embers to survive until morning. A properly banked fire could smoulder for hours, preserving the vital spark that would reignite the next day's flame. This technique, mastered through careful observation and practice, represented significant fuel savings at a time when gathering sufficient winter wood required immense effort. Winter navigation presented unique challenges in landscapes transformed by snow and ice. Medieval travellers developed methods for wayfinding when familiar landmarks disappeared beneath drifts or during snowstorms. In forested regions, travellers learned to identify the north side of trees by observing moss growth patterns, or the denser arrangement of branches on the southern side. Path markers, stones, crosses, or notched trees were placed at higher elevations unlikely to be completely buried by snow. When travelling across open country, particularly in northern regions where daylight became precious, people maintained awareness of wind direction to orient themselves when visibility diminished. Winter travellers often carried staffs not just for stability on slippery surfaces, but for probing snow depth before stepping, testing ice thickness on frozen waterways, and marking paths in fresh snow for those following behind. Emergency shelter construction remained essential knowledge in a world where travellers might become stranded by sudden storms or failing daylight. The simplest technique, used by shepherds and woodcutters, involved creating a windbreak of branches leaned against a fallen tree, then covering the structure with evergreen boughs and finally snow itself for insulation. More elaborate snow pits could be dug when conditions permitted, creating surprisingly warm enclosures insulated by snow's air-trapping properties. These survival structures, though temporary, could maintain enough body heat to prevent freezing until conditions improved or rescue arrived. Clothing management became a sophisticated skill unto itself. Medieval people understood layering principles centuries before modern outdoor enthusiasts rediscovered them. The poor, limited to few garments, would insert insulating materials between layers, Straw, dried moss, or crumpled dry leaves stuffed between an outer and inner layer provided significant additional warmth at no cost. Those venturing outdoors learned to avoid overheating and sweating, which would dampen clothes and ultimately lead to dangerous chilling. Work rhythms were moderated, with brief periods of intense activity followed by rest, preventing perspiration from soaking garments. Finding food during winter months required specialized knowledge that varied by region. In forested areas, people learned to identify which trees retained edible inner bark when other food sources failed. Hazel, aspen, birch and pine could provide emergency nutrition. Tracking animals through snow presented both challenges and opportunities, while moving through deep snow exhausted energy. The clear tracks left by game animals made them easier to follow. Specialized winter hunting techniques included identifying game trails where deer would struggle through deep snow, making them vulnerable to hunters on snowshoes who could move above the drifts. Water acquisition in freezing conditions demanded particular skill. Melting snow for drinking wasted precious body heat and fuel if done inefficiently. Medieval travelers learned to melt small amounts against the body before larger amounts over fire, and to avoid eating snow directly, which dangerously lowered core temperature. Winter travelers carried water in specialized containers tucked close to the body, often wrapped in wool to prevent freezing. Reading weather signs became especially crucial during winter. Cloud patterns, wind shifts, animal behavior, and the quality of silence before a storm all conveyed vital information to those who knew how to interpret these signs. The sudden disappearance of birds, unusual clarity of distant sounds, or a particular heaviness in the air warned of approaching storms, giving precious hours to seek shelter or complete essential tasks. These winter survival skills represented not separate techniques but an integrated way of living with seasonal challenges. What modern people might consider emergency knowledge was simply part of everyday winter existence for medieval communities, who recognized that safety through the cold months depended not on a single dramatic intervention, but on countless small adaptations and observations accumulated through generations of winter experience. Of all the regions in medieval Europe, none faced winter's challenges with greater intensity or for longer duration than the far northern lands. While Mediterranean peasants might experience brief frosts and occasional snow, those dwelling in Scandinavia, the Baltic shores, and the North Atlantic settlements endured a fundamentally different season, one where darkness claimed most of the day, where seas froze solid for months, and where survival demanded specialized knowledge refined over countless generations. The geographical expanse historians call Northern Europe encompassed diverse cultures united by their confrontation with extreme winter conditions. From the Norse peoples of Denmark, Sweden and Norway to the Finns, Balts and Slavic tribes of the eastern Baltic, these societies developed distinctive relationships with the coldest season. The Icelandic and later Greenlandic settlements pushed the boundaries of human adaptation even further, establishing communities at the very edge of winter's habitable realm. Winter transformed the northern landscape into something almost otherworldly. By midwinter, daylight in the northernmost settlements might last only 4 or 5 hours, creating what the Norse called the blue hour, a perpetual twilight where the snow reflected the sky's deep, azure hue, rather than the bright white of full daylight. This persistent dimness required adjustments not just in practical activities, but in psychological approach to the season. Northern folklore abounds with traditions to brighten the darkness reflected in the later development of Yule logs, candle ceremonies, and midwinter festivals that brought light and warmth into the heart of darkness. The frozen seas that modern people might view as barriers became highways for medieval northern Europeans. The Baltic Sea often froze so thoroughly that regular trade routes were established across the ice, connecting communities that remained separated by water during warmer months. Historical records describe ice roads, marked with evergreen branches, allowing merchants to travel directly from Sweden to Finland or across the Gulf of Bothnia. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized sleds designed specifically for ice travel, with metal-reinforced runners and distinctive proportions that distributed weight effectively across potentially thin ice. Northern European architecture evolved distinct forms to manage extreme winter conditions. The Norse longhouse, with its substantial timber walls and central hearth, represented perhaps the most efficient winter dwelling in medieval Europe. Unlike the open hall plan of southern noble residences, northern longhouses often featured sleeping platforms raised along the walls, where warm air collected away from the drafty floor. Smoke holes could be adjusted with movable covers to manage the balance between ventilation and heat retention, depending on outside temperatures. In Finland and parts of the Baltic region, different solutions emerged. The smoke sauna or savasauna, a building heated by a stone-covered hearth without a chimney, allowing smoke to fill the room before being vented, created superheated environments where temperatures could exceed 100 grader, 212 grader. These structures served not just for bathing, but as multi-purpose winter workspaces for everything from drying grain to smoking meat. Sometimes even for childbirth during the coldest weather, when the superheated, sterile environment offered protection for vulnerable newborns. The winter diet in Northern Europe reflected both necessity and ingenious preservation techniques. Fish, a dietary staple, was preserved through multiple methods: drying, as with Norwegian stockfish, smoking, salting, and fermentation. The infamous surströmming, fermented Baltic herring, developed in Sweden, and lutefisk, lye-soaked dried whitefish, represented preservation methods specifically suited to northern conditions, where intense cold and short summer drying seasons demanded creative solutions for protein preservation. Social organization adapted to winter's imperatives. The practice of moving together during winter appeared throughout Northern Europe's separate households that maintained independence during summer would consolidate during the coldest months, sharing resources, labor, and precious heat. Icelandic sagas describe winter arrangements where multiple families occupied a single longhouse, with complex social rules governing the shared space. This seasonal communalism represented a practical adaptation to winter's demands, while preserving the independent household as the basic social unit during productive seasons. Winter shaped the Northern European worldview in ways that resonated through religion and mythology. The cosmic struggle between fire and ice featured prominently in Norse cosmology, with the universe beginning in the meeting of these opposing forces and ultimately ending in the Fimbulwinter 3 successive winters, without summer that would precede Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. Winter spirits and deities received special attention in pre-Christian religious observance, from the wild hunt led by Odin thundering through winter skies to the various household spirits who required offerings during the darkest days to ensure protection for the home. After Christianization, many of these winter observances merged with the new faith. St. Lucia's Day on December 13th, near winter solstice in the Julian calendar, transformed pre-Christian light ceremonies into Christian observance. The extended Christmas celebration, far more elaborate in Northern Europe than in southern regions, incorporated many elements of earlier midwinter festivals designed to sustain community bonds and psychological well-being during the darkest period. Perhaps most remarkable about medieval Northern Europe was not just how these societies survived winter, but how they incorporated it into cultural identity. Winter-skill skiing, ice fishing, cold-weather navigation became sources of regional pride and distinctive expertise. The winter-adapted cultures of Northern Europe developed not just practical techniques, but aesthetic and spiritual traditions that embraced the season's unique qualities, finding beauty in the austere landscape and meaning in the cycle of light's death and rebirth that played out more dramatically here than anywhere else in medieval Europe. While the bitter cold of Northern Europe tested human endurance through sheer intensity, the Alpine regions presented a different kind of winter challenge. Stretching in a great arc from France through Switzerland, northern Italy, southern Germany, and into Austria, these mountainous territories confronted their inhabitants with a combination of extreme cold, treacherous terrain, avalanche danger, and profound isolation that demanded specialized adaptations found nowhere else in medieval Europe. The vertical nature of alpine landscapes transformed winter in ways lowland Europeans could scarcely comprehend. Villages might experience drastically different conditions depending on their elevation and orientation. A settlement in a sun-facing valley might enjoy relatively mild days, while another just a ridge away, shadowed by towering peaks, might remain buried in snow for months. These microclimates shaped everything from architecture to social organization, creating distinctive regional adaptations within the broader alpine culture. Alpine housing evolved to address the specific threats of mountain winters. The distinctive steep-pitched roofs, immediately recognizable in medieval illustrations, served multiple critical functions. Their sharp angles prevented crushing accumulations of snow, while still retaining the snow's insulating properties along the lower roof sections. Wide eaves protected walls from moisture damage during the freeze-thaw cycles common in mountain environments. In the higher settlements, homes were often partially built into hillsides, using the Earth's thermal mass for insulation against the most extreme temperatures. Perhaps most remarkable was the development of the multifunctional Alpine farmhouse, known in various regional forms as the Hof, Masso, or Beiter. Unlike the separate structures typical in lowland farms, these buildings combined living quarters, animal stables, food storage, and workshop space under a single roof. This arrangement minimized the need to venture outside during dangerous weather and created a natural heating system, with livestock warmth rising through the structure. A 14th century account from the Tyrolean Alps describes how the people live above their animals, benefiting from their heat which rises through the wooden floors, while hay stored in the attic provides further insulation against winter's fury. Economic activities adapted to the prolonged winter season. While lowland regions might see agricultural work paused for a few months, alpine communities faced snow cover lasting half the year or more. This seasonal reality fostered specialized winter crafts woodworking, textile production, clockmaking, and intricate carving that could be pursued indoors during the snowy months. By the late medieval period, these winter crafts had developed into significant industries with products traded throughout Europe. The practice of transhumance moving livestock between high summer pastures and lower winter quarters shaped the alpine year. Autumn cattle drives became elaborate community rituals marking the transition to winter mode, with animals brought down from high meadows before the first significant snowfall. The timing of these movements required sophisticated weather prediction based on generations of observed patterns and signs. A miscalculation could mean livestock trapped by early storms and entire communities facing economic catastrophe. Winter mobility in steep, snow-covered terrain demanded specialized equipment and techniques developed nowhere else in medieval Europe. Alpine communities crafted primitive snowshoes from bent wood and woven lacing to navigate deep snow. More remarkably, they developed early forms of skis, particularly in eastern Alpine regions, with cultural connections to Scandinavian traditions. Archaeological evidence from Alpine passes has revealed wooden ski fragments dating to the 11th and 12th centuries, while medieval manuscripts occasionally depict hunters using ski-like implements in mountain landscapes. For transporting goods down snow-covered slopes, Alpine communities developed specialized sledges with steering mechanisms and braking systems far more sophisticated than their lowland counterparts. These allowed essential supplies to reach isolated settlements when conventional wheeled transport became impossible. Along major mountain passes, way stations provided emergency shelter for travelers caught by sudden storms or avalanches. Many were maintained by monastic orders, most famously the hospice established by St. Bernard of Menthon at the pass now bearing his name. The ever-present danger of avalanches shaped both Alpine settlement patterns and social organization. Villages were typically located on slopes with historically lower avalanche activity, often identified through generations of observation. Protective forests above settlements were strictly managed, with prohibitions against cutting trees that might release deadly snowslides. The earliest known community-based avalanche defense systems emerged in the Alps, with stone walls and earthworks constructed to divert potential snowpaths away from human habitations. When avalanches did strike, established rescue protocols reflected sophisticated understanding of survival chances. Tools specifically designed for digging out avalanche victims have been found in archaeological contexts dating to the 13th century. Church bells would sound a distinctive pattern to summon all able-bodied residents for rescue efforts, reflecting the communal response necessary for survival in these extreme environments. Alpine spiritual practices incorporated winter's special presence in mountain life. Mountain passes and traveller shelters were marked with shrines to saints associated with protection from winter hazards. St. Bernard became particularly venerated as the patron of Alpine travellers. Local traditions included special blessings for homes before the onset of winter isolation, and rituals marking the winter solstice, with fire symbolism that blended Christian and pre-Christian elements. When spring finally arrived, communities celebrated with distinctive festivals marking their survival through another mountain winter. Despite their winter isolation, Alpine communities maintained crucial connections to wider European society. The mountain passes they controlled, the St. Bernard, St. Gotthard and Brenner among others, served as essential trade arteries between northern and southern Europe. Alpine guides, with their specialized knowledge of winter navigation, facilitated year-round travel through their territories, making even winter commerce possible, albeit reduced and hazardous. This strategic position gave Alpine communities significant economic and political importance, despite their relatively small populations and challenging environment. The medieval Alpine experience thus represents one of history's most successful examples of human adaptation to extreme winter conditions. Through specialized architecture, equipment, community structures, and accumulated environmental knowledge, these mountain dwellers transformed potentially lethal winter conditions into a sustainable seasonal rhythm that would continue largely unchanged into the early modern era. While the peoples of northern Europe and Alpine regions battled deep snows and bitter cold, Those dwelling along the Mediterranean rim experienced a dramatically different winter reality. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Italian shores, from southern France to the Greek islands, winter manifested not as an overwhelming force of nature requiring elaborate survival strategies, but as a gentler, if sometimes unpredictable, season of intermittent hardship and surprising opportunity. The Mediterranean winter arrived not with snow and ice, but with rain, often torrential downpours that transformed dusty summer creek beds into raging torrents within hours. These deluges, though less immediately life-threatening than northern blizzards, presented their own hazards. Flash floods could destroy crops, wash away soil, and render roads impassable for days. A Catalan chronicle from the early 14th century describes a winter storm that brought down water from the mountains like God's own judgment, sweeping away 3 mills and drowning 7 souls caught crossing the river. Between these dramatic rain episodes stretched periods of surprising pleasantness. Winter days in Mediterranean regions often dawned clear and mild, with temperatures rarely dropping below freezing during daylight hours. Medieval accounts from southern Italy and Spain frequently mention outdoor activities continuing throughout winter months, markets operating in village squares, construction projects proceeding, and agricultural work continuing with only brief weather-related interruptions. This climate pattern shaped distinctive agricultural rhythms that inverted those of northern regions. While northern European fields lay dormant under snow, Mediterranean farmers experienced winter as a season of growth rather than suspension. The Mediterranean agricultural calendar centered around winter rain and summer drought. Cereal crops were planted with the first autumn rains and grew steadily through the mild winter months, taking advantage of consistent moisture. A Sicilian agricultural manual from the 13th century instructed farmers to commit seed to earth when the autumn star rises and the first heavenly waters come, allowing crops to establish themselves during winter's relatively gentle temperatures. Winter actually represented the prime growing season for many Mediterranean crops. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and various greens flourished during these months when moisture was abundant and temperatures moderate. The relative agricultural productivity during winter meant Mediterranean communities faced less dramatic food scarcity than their northern counterparts, though food preservation remained essential for managing supply fluctuations. Architectural adaptations reflected these different environmental challenges. Mediterranean dwellings with their thick stone walls and small windows served a dual purpose, keeping interiors cool during scorching summers and maintaining warmth during brief cold spells. Unlike northern homes designed primarily to trap heat, Mediterranean houses focused on managing moisture during winter months. Sloped tile roofs directed heavy rainfall away from foundations, while interior courtyards in wealthier homes provided protected outdoor spaces usable even during winter rain episodes. Heating arrangements were notably minimal compared to northern standards. Simple braziers burning charcoal or olive wood prunings provided adequate warmth during chilly evenings. In Venice, whose winter climate was harsher than most Mediterranean cities due to its northern latitude and lagoon setting, the fogolaro, a raised hearth in the centre of main rooms, offered a compromise between Mediterranean simplicity and northern necessity. The Mediterranean winter brought dramatic changes to maritime activities. The period between October and March, what ancient Romans had called mare closum, the closed sea, remained dangerous for extensive sea voyages due to unpredictable storms. While medieval shipping never completely ceased during winter as it had in ancient times, it reduced significantly. Ports like Genoa, Venice, Barcelona, and Constantinople saw their busiest activity compressed into the spring through autumn months, with winter representing a period of ship repair, limited local fishing, and careful coastal trading during favourable weather windows. This seasonal pattern created distinctive winter economies in Mediterranean urban centres. With shipping reduced, cities turned inward, focusing on manufacturing, particularly textile production. Genoa's winter economy shifted emphasis from maritime commerce to financial activities and cloth production. Venice maintained winter glass production operations in Murano, taking advantage of the season when fire hazards were reduced by damp conditions. For peasants in Mediterranean regions, winter offered periods of relative leisure between rainfall events. Olive harvesting occupied November and December, while pruning of vines and fruit trees continued throughout the milder days of January and February. These tasks, though demanding, lacked the desperate intensity of northern winter work, where every moment of daylight required maximum efficiency. Religious observances in the Mediterranean took on distinctive seasonal characteristics. The winter feast of Christmas coincided not with the extreme privation experienced in northern climates, but with a period when fresh food remained relatively available. This allowed Mediterranean Christmas celebrations to incorporate greater fresh food abundance. The Feast of St. Agatha in Sicily and the winter celebration of St. Lucy in southern Italy featured processions that could reliably occur outdoors, unlike their northern counterparts that often contended with impassable snows. For Mediterranean Jewish communities, winter brought Hanukkah celebrations that could include outdoor elements impossible in northern regions. In Toledo and other Sephardic centres, community celebrations often spilled into courtyards and streets during favourable winter evenings. Perhaps most distinctive was the Mediterranean psychological relationship to winter. While northern Europeans developed a siege mentality of endurance against winter's assault, Mediterranean peoples experienced the season as a variable rhythm of pleasant and challenging days. A Provençal poem from the 13th century captures this ambivalence. Winter brings both the blessing of rain to our thirsting fields and the curse of storms to our fragile boats. We neither love nor hate this season, but accept its mixed gifts with caution and gratitude. This fundamentally different winter experience, neither as threatening as the northern deep freeze nor as extreme as alpine conditions, created a distinctive Mediterranean cultural relationship with the coldest season, one that balanced appreciation for its agricultural benefits against respect for its occasional destructive potential. Beyond the Alpine peaks and the Baltic shores lay the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, where winter arrived not as a visitor but as a conqueror. From the Polish forests to the Russian steppes, from the Carpathian foothills to the frozen reaches of Novgorod, medieval Eastern Europeans faced winters of legendary severity. Here, continental climate patterns, untemperated by warm ocean currents, created a winter world of particular brutality, with temperatures plunging far below those experienced in Western Europe, and snowfalls that could bury entire villages in a single night. The architecture of Eastern Europe evolved distinctive features specifically designed to combat these extreme conditions. The most characteristic dwelling, perfected over centuries of winter trial and error, was the traditional izba, log house built from massive pine or spruce trunks, horizontally stacked and carefully notched at the corners for structural integrity. Unlike the wattle and daub structures common in Western Europe, these solid wooden walls provided superior insulation against bitter cold. The logs, some measuring up to 18 inches in diameter, created walls nearly impenetrable to winter winds. At the izba's heart stood the pech, a massive clay or stone oven that served as both cooking surface and primary heat source. Unlike the open hearths of Western Europe, the Russian pech was a fully enclosed structure occupying up to 1/4 of the living space. Its enormous thermal mass absorbed heat during morning firing and radiated warmth throughout the day and night. The pech featured a flat top where family members could sleep during the coldest nights, while benches built along walls and around the oven provided additional sleeping spaces graded by warmth, with the most vulnerable family members assigned the warmest positions. The roofs of Eastern European dwellings typically featured steep pitches to prevent snow accumulation, but with a critical innovation. The snow itself became an insulating asset. Properly designed overhanging eaves created a zone where snow could build up around the foundation walls, providing an additional layer of natural insulation. In the deepest winter, many peasant homes became partially buried snow structures, with only the roof and a pathway to the door remaining visible. Food preservation in Eastern Europe relied heavily on freezing, a technique less available to their Western counterparts. Root cellars were designed with carefully controlled ventilation systems that could admit freezing air during early winter, effectively transforming these spaces into natural freezers where meat would remain preserved for months. Fresh-killed game and livestock were often stacked in unheated outbuildings, becoming frozen solid until portions were harvested with axes and saws for the cooking pot. Fermentation reached its highest development as a preservation method in these regions. The iconic staple sauerkraut, pickled mushrooms and kvass, a fermented beverage made from bread, provided vital nutrients through the winter months. The distinctively Eastern European practice of lactofermentation using salt brine rather than vinegar preserved vegetables while creating probiotic-rich foods that helped maintain health during winter confinement. Winter transportation across the snowy expanses required specialized technology. The Eastern European sleigh evolved beyond the simple runners of Western Europe into a sophisticated vehicle with iron-shod runners carefully curved and polished to minimize friction on snow. For personal movement across deep snow, peasants developed lapti snowshoes woven from lime tree bark that distributed weight and prevented sinking. In the northern forests, early forms of skis allowed hunters to pursue game across otherwise impassable terrain. Perhaps the most distinctive Eastern European winter adaptation was the banya or steam bath. These separate wooden structures, heated to extreme temperatures by stones placed on a fire, created a purifying sweat bath that cleansed bodies unable to bathe conventionally during winter. The practice of alternating between the banya's intense heat and brief exposure to winter air, sometimes including snow rubbing or plunging through ice holes into freezing water, served both hygienic and medical purposes, stimulating circulation and relieving the physical and psychological strain of winter confinement. Winter clothing reflected both the extreme conditions and available materials. The Russian tulupa, a massive sheepskin coat worn with the fleece turned inward, created a microclimate around the wearer's body. Multiple layers of linen and wool beneath, often including traditional Kosovorotka shirts and sarafan dresses, provided additional insulation. Valenki boots made from felted sheep's wool insulated feet better than any leather footwear, while cylindrical fur hats protected heads and ears. Mittens, rather than gloves, were standard even for nobility, as the shared finger space conserved vital heat. Social organization during winter reflected the critical importance of communal survival strategies. The Eastern European village Mir community maintained collective responsibility for winter preparations. Full slaughter was often a communal event, with careful distribution of meat ensuring every household received portions regardless of livestock ownership. Woodcutting expeditions were similarly collective, with shared labour ensuring all homes had adequate fuel before deep snow made forests inaccessible. Religious observation incorporated winter's realities into its practice. Orthodox Christmas celebrations, held on January 7th under the Julian calendar, featured distinctive winter rituals, including the carving of ice crosses for Epiphany celebrations. Winter saints received particular veneration: Saint Nicholas as protector against winter's fury, and St. George as guarantor of wolves, a winter menace particularly feared in eastern villages. From these harsh conditions emerged winter adaptations of remarkable sophistication. Eastern European communities transformed survival necessity into cultural identity, creating technologies, practices, and social systems that not only endured winter's assault, but incorporated its rhythms into the very fabric of their civilization. As the wheel of the year turns towards spring once again, our journey through the medieval experience of winter draws to a close. We have traversed landscapes of snow and ice, ventured into smoke-filled peasant cottages and grand castle halls, observed the intricate preparations of farmers and the calculated diplomacy of kings adjusting to winter's demands. Through this exploration, certain fundamental truths about the medieval relationship with winter emerge, insights that transcend the particular historical moment to reveal something enduring about human adaptation to seasonal extremes. Perhaps most striking is the profound intentionality with which medieval people approached winter. Unlike modern societies, where technological buffers often allow us to treat winter as a mere inconvenience, medieval communities recognized the season as an existential challenge requiring year-round attention. The agricultural calendar was structured around winter's inevitability. Spring planting decisions were made with winter scarcity in mind. Summer activities balanced immediate needs against winter's coming demands. Autumn's harvests were carefully managed resources that would determine survival months later. This temporal awareness, the constant consciousness of winter's approach even during the warmest days, shaped medieval life at every level. The sophistication of medieval winter adaptations defies simplistic notions about the period. From the multi-layered clothing systems of northern Europe to the elaborate food preservation techniques documented in monastic records, from the clever architectural modifications that trapped precious heat to the communal resource-sharing systems that protected the vulnerable medieval people, developed remarkably effective strategies for winter survival. What they lacked in scientific understanding, they compensated for through meticulous observation, generational knowledge, and pragmatic innovation. Regional diversity in winter experiences and adaptations reveals how deeply environmental conditions shape cultural development. The extreme northern winters produced societies structured around communal survival and resource conservation, with distinctive cultural expressions like the Gvildvaka storytelling tradition. Alpine communities developed specialized knowledge of snow conditions and avalanche risks that became embedded in local governance structures. Mediterranean populations, with their milder but still challenging winter conditions, created flexible systems that could rapidly adjust to occasional cold snaps. These regional differences remind us that medieval Europe was never a monolithic culture, but rather a mosaic of adaptations to specific environmental conditions. Social stratification profoundly influenced the winter experience, perhaps more dramatically than in any other season. For the nobility, winter might bring inconveniences and constraints on travel or warfare, but their massive stone walls, multiple hearths, well-stocked larders, and abundant fuel supplies created environments of relative comfort. For the peasantry, the same season could mean the difference between life and death, with success or failure in winter preparation having immediate physical consequences. Yet even this stark contrast is complicated by evidence of community support systems, charitable obligations, and cultural adaptations that helped mitigate winter's harshest effects for the most vulnerable. The psychological dimensions of winter survival emerge clearly in the rich traditions of winter festivals, storytelling practices, and religious observances that punctuated the darkest months. These were not merely diversions but essential components of winter resilience. By transforming the period of greatest physical challenge into a time of spiritual significance and community bonding, medieval people created frameworks of meaning that helped sustain morale through the darkest days. The strategic placement of religious celebrations during the depths of winter Christmas near the solstice, Candlemas as light begins returning, provided rhythmic reassurance that darkness would not prevail indefinitely. Technological developments reveal a slow but steady improvement in winter conditions throughout the medieval millennium. The progression from central hearths to sophisticated chimney systems, from simple windbreaks to insulated glass windows, from basic cloaks to carefully engineered multi-layer garments, represents a continuous process of innovation, focused on the fundamental human need for warmth. What stands out is not the pace of change, which was indeed gradual by modern standards, but the remarkable effectiveness achieved with limited materials and pre-industrial techniques. Winter's impact on medieval mentalities extended beyond immediate survival concerns. The season became a powerful metaphor in religious thought, artistic expression, and philosophical reflection. Winter represented both the soul's desolation and the promise of eventual renewal. It served as a canvas upon which medieval people projected their understanding of life's hardships and the cyclical nature of human experience. This metaphorical dimension reminds us that winter was not merely endured but made meaningful within cultural frameworks that transformed physical challenge into spiritual significance. The historical record also reveals the vulnerability of medieval winter adaptations to climate shifts. Both the medieval climate optimum and the subsequent Little Ice Age demonstrate how relatively small temperature changes, just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius on average, could dramatically affect food security, settlement patterns, and social stability. Communities that had developed finely tuned systems for specific winter conditions found these systems inadequate when climate patterns shifted, forcing rapid adaptation or, in some cases, abandonment of previously sustainable lifeways. This historical perspective offers a sobering insight into the potential disruptions of our own era of climate change. The Black Death, arriving as the climate cooled in the 14th century, demonstrates how winter challenges could compound other crises. The plague's winter manifestation is primarily pneumonic rather than bubonic, spreading through the close quarters necessitated by cold, reveals the complex interplay between disease and seasonality. The demographic catastrophe of the plague subsequently transformed winter labor practices, resource allocation, and social hierarchies, showing how winter experiences were never isolated from broader historical developments, but intimately connected to them. Throughout these explorations of medieval winter, we repeatedly encounter evidence of human ingenuity, adaptability, and perseverance. From the precise timing of slaughter seasons to maximize winter meat preservation, to the careful breeding of sheep for wool with superior insulating properties, to the development of ice roads across frozen Baltic waters, medieval people consistently transformed winter constraints into opportunities through careful observation and generational knowledge. As our modern world faces its own environmental challenges, this medieval perspective offers valuable insights. Their seasonal awareness, the constant consciousness of natural cycles and the need to work within environmental constraints stands in stark contrast to modern assumptions about our independence from nature's rhythms. Their communal approaches to resource management and crisis response remind us that individual action alone is rarely sufficient when facing environmental challenges. Their capacity to find meaning and even joy within winter's constraints through festivals, creative expression, and spiritual observance demonstrates how human resilience operates through culture as much as through technology. The medieval winter experience was never static, but evolved continuously through technological innovation, climate change, social reorganization, and cultural development. What persisted throughout these changes was a fundamental recognition that winter required both practical preparation and psychological adaptation, that survival depended on careful management of both material resources and human morale. As they gathered around hearth fires on long winter evenings, medieval communities created spaces of warmth and light against the surrounding darkness, small havens of human connection that enabled them to endure until spring's return. In this fundamental pattern, the creation of physical and social warmth against winter's cold, we recognize something timeless about the human relationship with winter. Though our methods have changed dramatically, we still respond to winter's challenge by gathering together, preserving resources, creating light in darkness, and finding meaning in the seasonal cycle of death and rebirth. The medieval experience of winter, for all its historical distance, reflects essential human responses to seasonal extremes that continue to shape our lives today, even as we sleep beneath modern roofs, warmed by invisible heating systems, dreaming perhaps of these earlier winters when humanity's relationship with the coldest season was more direct, more challenging, and in some ways more profoundly meaningful.